Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Raw Diplomacy. My name is Gabriela Flores, and I am with the Natural Resource Governance Institute. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this event on behalf of the organizers, the Business and Human Rights Center, Chatham House, Climate Home News, and NRGI. We're here as part of London Climate Action Week, to talk about the minerals that power the energy transition. Who extracts them, on what terms, who benefits, and what is the accountability to people and planet? These are some of the questions that we'll be exploring today. Before I hand you over to our first moderator, I want to also extend a very warm welcome to all of you following this event via the live stream. So we have a packed agenda, fast-moving, and we're going to make every minute count. So with that, to get started, I want to hand over to our moderator for the first session, Chloe Ferrand, who is editor of Climate Home News' Clean Energy Frontier series on clean tech supply chains and energy transition minerals. Chloe, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabriela, and thanks so much to everyone for making it and braving the heat to be here. Hopefully you're all feeling cool and you can just enjoy the conversation today. So we're going to start with in conversation, slightly a formal, bit fast-paced discussion about the latest developments in mineral governance. We've seen that, as you all know, I'm sure demand for minerals is booming. That's for the energy transition and to produce the clean energy technologies and the infrastructure that we need to move away from fossil fuels. But we're also seeing a lot of demand from AI and data centers and to some extent defense as well. And in this kind of fast-moving environment, we've got this flurry of new minerals partnerships that are emerging, some of them bilateral, some of them plurilateral between different groups of countries. And the terms of these deals are really going to define how producing countries, whether they lose or they gain from this energy transition and the demand we have now for critical minerals. We've heard the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres yesterday repeat it in his speech that there can be no more extraction without development. And I think this is really what we're trying to explore today. Last week, we had the G7 meeting in France, and there was a quite lengthy statement on critical minerals. And we saw government recognize the need for mutually beneficial partnerships based on high quality standards or high standards and transparency. However, what that means in practice was kind of left pretty unclear in the statement. And also, how is that implemented? What does that actually mean for those economies and for jobs was also left unclear. And we're here today with three fantastic speakers who can help us a bit understand this recent development and also throw it forward to minerals governance in the year ahead. So joining me today, just directly here on my left, is Céline Kaufmann. She's the Chief Programs Officer at the French think tank IDRI, which coordinated the Think 7, or T7, which is the official engagement group for global think tanks to provide recommendations for the G7. Next to her is Patrick Schroeder, who's a Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House. And Patrick's work focuses on resource governance in critical mineral value chains. And he also co-chaired the T7 group working on recommendations on securing responsible and equitable critical minerals value chains. And then we're delighted to have join us online as well, Sasha Raab, who's the head of the Global Alliance for Responsible and Green Minerals at UNIDO. UNIDO is the UN Industrial Development Organization, and it'll be great to hear from Sasha a bit. I'm sure he can give you a brief overview of what the Alliance does. But before we get to that, let's get sort of straight into the events of last week. Céline, you've been following the G7 really, really closely. What did you take away from the agreement, the statement that was agreed last week in France?
Thank you very much, Chloe. I'm very happy to be here today. And indeed, I'm going to provide a descriptive, description of what we've seen happening within the G7, because Patrick is the one who really did the work within the G7 on the CRM recommendations. Just to take a step back, if you remember the speech of President Macron at the UN General Assembly last September, he had set two broad objectives for the G7. One was on addressing macroeconomic imbalances, and the second one was on renewing development partnerships. If you look at what has happened throughout the month, we've seen a number of ministerial meetings culminating to the Evian summit of last week. Last week, what happened is that the leaders put on the table 9 thematic declarations on health, on geopolitics, on macroeconomic imbalances, on AI and kids. And there was one on mutually beneficial partnerships and one on critical raw materials. But if you look throughout the year, critical raw materials has really been at the center of the discussions, because the trade ministerial, had a section, communique had a section on CRM. The labor ministerial had a section on forced labor in relation to CRM supply chain. Obviously, the trade one was on supply chains for CRM. The finance minister and central bank governors communique had a section on economic security that was all about CRM. So, of course, it was not surprising that there would be convergence at the summit last week. What did we see happening last week? In the declaration, the communique and the discussions, a very strong push towards diversifying CRM supply chains to avoid heavy reliance or dependence on one big supplier, China. To the extent that the G7 countries adopted specific targets for permanent magnet and for rare earth supply chains, whereby they commit, where they announced that they would try to achieve a decrease in their dependency towards, without naming China, from more or less 90% in those supply chains to 60% by 2030 and to 50% in the longer run. They also said that they would develop targets for other critical minerals by the end of the year. The feasibility of those targets, is very hard to assess, but it will be very challenging, because if you look at the International Energy Agency data, we are on a course on current projects and announced projects that is nowhere near the 60% target that the G7 countries put on the table. So it will need a big push. I'm saying that because this is obviously an opportunity for developing partnerships with countries that are not China on, production, but also refining capacity. The other 2 points I want to raise on this declaration are the following. There was a very strong focus within that declaration on circular economy, on even, kind of putting on the table that the G7 countries would develop targets for recycled material within the supply chains. So this is something that we will see probably happening. There was a very strong focus as well on accountability and traceability within supply chains, relying on the IEA and the OECD to provide the data to understand how the supply chains are evolving, including the business deals that are happening. We saw, and I wouldn't say if it's connected, but China announcing a new regulation forbidding any kind of information provision that would allow traceability. So we can see that, the dynamics will be difficult in any case. And the last thing is we did see mention in this declaration of balanced, resilient supply chains involving more mutually beneficial partnerships with like-minded countries and with other countries without defining which ones.
Yes, and I think we'll be talking a lot about, quotes, mutually beneficial partnerships and quotes, and I think the whole discussion, part of the discussion today is trying to understand what that means and particularly what that should mean from a producing country perspective. And I think from the a lot of critics, I guess, from the G7 last week were saying that this group of wealthy countries were actually just focused on securing mineral supplies and diversifying away from China. And there was this language around mutually beneficial partnerships, but actually what that means in practice remains really marginal in the discussion. At the same time, as you just mentioned, there was a whole different bit of the conversation around mutually beneficial partnerships as part of the G7. Can you just briefly say, what you make of that and whether there was coherence in those messaging?
Yeah, definitely. And you're completely right. I mean, the economic security agenda was very strong on the G7. But at the same time, what you saw throughout the ministerial discussions were quite siloed declarations, on critical economic security, critical minerals, and then on development partnerships. And at the T7, we've been pushing, including through the communique, to have more links across. Because what happened is that the development ministerial communique had a very strong focus on a new narrative towards, of development partnerships. And the background of that is obviously the cuts in ODA and concessional finance, but it was putting very strongly country ownership, mutually beneficial partnerships to the forefront. What we've seen with Evian on the summit is more connections across. And the connections we've seen beyond the wording and the language that was percolating the different declarations was also a more, let's say, critical use of the multilateral development banks, for example, leveraging their capacity to finance the supply chains. And I don't know if you follow what has happened at the spring meetings in Washington, the IMF and World Bank meetings, but there was a joint declaration of the MDBs that was focusing on the critical raw materials. So one of the plans of the G7 countries that are key shareholders in those MDBs is really to try and leverage this investment and financing capacity. But of course, there's a big question mark because, on the other hand, we know the big cuts in ODA and concessional finance, which means that this small remaining pot of concessional finance will be prioritized in, selected areas, and the declaration of Evian mentioned a few of these areas, and they are vulnerable countries, they are, social sectors where it's most needy, humanitarian aid, and so on. So big question mark on how it can be used to this value addition purpose in developing countries.
Yeah. Patrick, I'd like to come to you. What did you make of the G7 last week?
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here. Yeah, similarly, actually, I would see it was mostly focused on the securitization aspect, right? How do you diversify away from China? How do you create new kind of diverse supply chains? On the positive side, the circularity aspect, I think, that's an area I've been working in. And it's circularity of minerals is going to become increasingly important. There are multiple studies now that show that by 2050, the supply for Europe can be met by well over 50% through secondary materials. And so this is also something where we need to see investments. So the language was good in the declaration. Now we need to see investments and supporting businesses that work in the circularity of minerals. And that's actually an opportunity also for partnerships, right? Because the partnerships with countries in the Global South can also be on circularity. Yeah, generally I also agree it's not so strong on the mutually beneficial partnerships. In the T7 recommendations that we put out, we had stronger hopes. We wanted to actually, we highlighted this as an opportunity to create something of a political compact between G7 and other countries, G20. So there were some G20 countries also present. It's interesting to see that India endorsed it, but Brazil didn't. I expect because there was no language on indigenous peoples, the language on environment was very weak. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, yeah.
And as we're talking about this attempt from the West to diversify away from China, we've also got some news from Monday where we've seen that China has actually been expanding rare earth export control on some American companies, and this is in retaliation for Washington placing restrictions on Chinese companies earlier this month. How do you see these tensions in a few words? Like, how do you see this geopolitical situation play onto any efforts to really develop mutually beneficial partnerships for developing countries?
So it's the US-China competition on technology and trade, economic. This is actually what drives a lot of the securitization discussion on critical minerals. And that's quite unfortunate because the story could actually be quite positive because, right, we can use these minerals to build an energy system that doesn't depend on fossil fuels. So it could be a positive story. And many of these partnerships could be actually also then bringing local development to align this agenda. So yeah, the US-China competition kind of undermines all that because it creates this sense of urgency. We need to quickly diversify. There's no time to do environmental impact assessments. There's no time to create the benefits. It's very much everybody now trying to stockpile, to access, and that's very unfortunate. The other aspect here is also, so we do want to diversify from China as main supplier. At the same time, what's important for Europe, we do not want to become or create other dependencies on the United States, right? Because we have already dependencies in terms of AI and tech, kind of dependencies with NATO. If we now create new dependencies that the US is needed for European resource security, I think that's a missed opportunity for Europe and the UK to create a better system and the partnerships with other countries.
Yeah, some really interesting points. Sasha, thanks so much for joining us online. It's great to see you. Also, same question to you, really. What were your reflections on the G7 statement that we saw last week? And as part of the alliance, you're doing, so this alliance actually is brings together multi-stakeholders. There's governments, private sector, civil society to promote inclusive and sustainable industrial development and mineral supply chains. So you're speaking to governments a lot. What are you also hearing from mineral producing countries about the types of partnership they would like to see?
Yes, Chloe, thank you very much for having me. And I wished I could have been in London today myself, especially because that's a very good news, I think, also for multilateralism and the United Nations. United Kingdom joined yesterday officially our organization, UNIDO, again, and I think that's a good signal. And our Director General was also yesterday there in London for the signatures. And as you mentioned, G7 and mineral, producing countries, we at UNIDO and on our Global Alliance, we want to create a win-win situation for the countries that are mineral rich and the countries that need the minerals for their energy transition. And I have to be a little bit diplomatic, about the G7 declaration. Let me put it that way. I think you asked me about the mineral rich countries. I think what they really want is to overcome the division of labor, which is right now worldwide, in that way that a lot of developing countries are only extracting minerals and the value addition is taking place somewhere else. Yeah, and the mineral-rich countries, they want corporations, partnerships on a level playing field, meaning to move beyond extraction, to facilitate investment in local value addition and share benefits in a fair manner. And in that respect, I probably have here all the Chatham House rules because this is also organized by Chatham House. So don't quote me, but I think from the point of mineral-rich countries, for instance, export restrictions or the right to regulate can be a measure which is also helpful to boost local value addition. And not everywhere it works, but we also see some successful cases. So I would not, because I was also at the OECD Critical Minerals Forum, and the OECD also took a very critical, view towards policies that put, let's say, taxes on raw materials that go out of the country. And they have, a lot of countries do know this tax systems that the more processed the minerals are, the less taxes, and the less taxes that are imposed, the less export taxes, and the more raw the minerals go, the higher the taxes are. I don't want to judge that, but I just want to say I can understand very well that countries are doing this, and I think we should be careful to see that only from a G7 or OECD point of view, because for decades, mineral-rich countries were told, oh, well, we do everything that you can have more local value addition, but if we're honest, there was too little done. And our global alliance wants to break with this, wants to overcome this. As you said, Chloe, we want to bring governments, private sector, financial institutions, civil society, affected communities, indigenous people, labor unions, academia. We have them all on board. And we want to really bring local value addition and fair benefit sharing on the ground, combined also with strong ESG standards, with capacity building for that. That is also what mineral-rich countries want, that they want support, capacity building to implement and enforce ESG standards. And so we have a whole set of technology transfer and skills development tools that we offer. And I think I maybe leave it with that. And I think this is, I think, the main, what I hear from the mineral-rich country of the Global South. We want value addition, we want jobs, we want a fair benefit sharing, and we want partnerships on a level playing field, and we want the right to regulate so that we can achieve that.
And we'll hear more directly from some producing country voices later today. That's really some interesting points, especially about export restrictions, which we'll also come back to a bit later. But I wanted to ask you, Sasha, about your work with China, because UNIDO is actually directly working with China. China last year, on the sidelines of the G20, launched its International Economic and Trade Cooperation initiative on green mining and minerals. A bit of a mouthful, but it would be interesting if you could tell us how are you engaging with China? Like, what is the work that you're doing with them on this initiative? Maybe just in a few, briefly, if you can, just tell us what that looks like.
Yes, I'm glad to do this, Chloe. I mean, China, first of all, is, of course, a member of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and they also joined our Global Alliance for Responsible and Green Minerals. And they also launched an initiative which is called International Economic and Trade Cooperation Initiative on Green Mining and Minerals, short IGM. And the Chinese Chamber of Commerce of Metals and Minerals, CCMC, is the secretary of this. And so they join our initiative. We support also their initiative and try to align our common goals, because we want to really encourage all members who join the Global Alliance to go on a path with responsible and sustainable mineral supply chains. And I mentioned that this word, to go on a path, because I know that China and some other actors are sometimes seen by some, let's say, governments of the world critical. I mean, we as United Nations, we have members from all over the world, and we welcome China very much because China is the biggest player in the sector, and we really are happy that they want to go on a path with us. But a membership in the Global Alliance does not mean that everything is already perfect. Yeah, no matter if it's a private sector member or if it's a government. So we want to encourage China to really fulfill this intention of will that they shown by joining our initiative. And we work with them in two sectors. We want to work with them. The one is, as we want to do a benchmarking exercise, setting up with all stakeholders in the Global Alliance criteria for ESG, and then we want to benchmark the existing standards against them, like a neutral referee. And this includes also verification and control mechanisms, which is very important. Standards is the one thing, but that they're implemented on the ground is same important. And China is welcome to work with Energy Eye and NGOs and other members together on that. And we also want to work with China with private actors in the area of skills development in the countries that they engage, for instance, in Africa. And those are areas of cooperations we are thinking about. So we'll see how we will make this more concrete in the next month. But I want to stress again, we're a neutral multi-stakeholder initiative where China is one of many members, and we're glad to hear their voice, and we're glad to work with the initiative together. But everyone who works in our initiative has to commit themselves to the 7 guiding principles of the Secretary General's panel on critical energy transition measurements. And as you know, we also implement the 5 action recommendations. Unity and the Global Alliance is one of the main implementers, and everything has to be aligned with the United Nations business and human rights regulations.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's work together.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sasha. Sorry to cut you a little bit short there, but just mindful of time. I just wanted to very quick fire in the time we've got left, maybe 2 or 3 top things I'm going to ask you each. What needs to happen next on mineral governance, and particularly how do we move from this G7 statement to the G20 next year, which the UK is presiding over? What would be the 2 or 3 points that you would want to see the UK pick up next year? Maybe very briefly. Céline first. Yeah.
Okay. No, thank you very much. From what I was mentioning, there's a lot of these commitments that are being made, but need to land somewhere. So this new development, kind of finance vision, the mutually beneficial partnerships, the kind of targets to diversifying the supply chains. All of that, they are, kind of statement of intent that need to land somewhere. So there's a lot for the UK G20 to take forward, knowing that this year G20 is presided over by the US, and we know, a lot of the tracks don't exist anymore. And I think along the T7 work, we would, in particular, look at what's happening in terms of the leveraging over the PDBs for the investment, the public development banks, because money, is also, and resources are at the heart of the solution. So how it's going to be effectively implemented, which supply chains, which sectors, which countries are going to, benefit from that. And from the T7, one of the recommendations that I think was super important is we need to see pilot projects, right? Pilots where very concretely we have this mutually beneficial partnership concept being implemented with the money coming in, with the value addition example. And to be honest, I don't think that it needs to target countries. It needs to target regions. There needs to be regional kind of underpinning and landing for that.
Yeah, implementation, concrete projects, pilots. Patrick, briefly, if you can.
Yeah, I think the UK should take up critical minerals as a topic, and I think that will happen. There's also still time to influence the UK's direction on the G20. So everyone who works on minerals, if you have contacts to the government, bring up your topic, I think. And I think it'll be important to connect to the minerals framework that was developed by South Africa last year, and then see how you can build on that.
Great, thank you. Sasha, any top messages for what needs to happen next on how do we close this global minerals governance gap?
Yes, maybe just what I pick up what I said in the end. We also have to. Our focus are the people on the ground It should be the people on the ground. Industrialization is not a means to an end, and ESG standards is also not a means to an end, just that a company can say, well, to their customers, well, we're so sustainable. It is important to really see what's happening on the ground. And I see a huge gap between sustainability as a word and between sustainability on the ground. And I think we have to focus to close the gap more on really credible verification and control mechanisms on the ground. And because people are really fed up about words, they also don't want to be only protected from negative impacts of mining. They want to benefit from mining operations, which of course really affect their livelihoods. And then it's not just enough to say, well, you know, we take care that your river is not polluted. If they cannot use the land anymore, they really want to benefit from the infrastructure, from access to energy, from medical services, from educational, you know, facilities, and from better jobs that they can do. And I think this is what we have to focus on to close the gap between words and between what's happening on the ground. So let's implement. Let's enforce, let's do capacity building, and let's really, you know, work for the improvement of active communities, indigenous people.
Brilliant. That seems a fantastic place to leave it. Thank you so much to Sasha, to Celine, and to Patrick for this session. Thank you again, Sasha, for joining us online. That was just quick fire on the geopolitical, the latest development on the geopolitics, and I'm going to hand it back over to Gabriella for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Chloe, Celine, Patrick, and to Sasha for setting us off in such an insightful way. So from the G7, the G20, and global mineral governance, we're going to move closer to what happens on the ground. Specifically, we're going to be looking at company performance. We're about to get a live look at the Business and Human Rights Center Transition Mineral Tracker. So for that, I'll hand you over to Phil Bloomer, who's Strategic Advisor at BHRC, and to Kay Rafitoson, who is the Executive Director at the Resource Justice Network.
Thank you. I'll have that clicker. Thanks very much, Gabriella. That's great. And wasn't that a fantastic panel to start us off the day? So as Gabriella says, this is much more about the latest transition mineral tracker that's coming out. And I think you need to be observant that just because Kay and I are at distance, we are actually quite close friends, so that's okay. The next thing to say, we were asked to sit here because you can then see the screen. Anyway, moving on. So each year for the last 7 years, the Business and Human Rights Center has delivered a transition mineral tracker. And it's part of our contribution to really contribute to a fast and fair transition across the renewable energy supply chain, from the extraction of minerals through to the manufacture of plant and then the installation and operation of renewable energy systems. Now, the fact that today I think I'm suffering temperatures that my colleague Betty Yolanda in Jakarta is not suffering is an indication of just how important and urgent this is. But the energy transition will only be fast if it is fair. And our transition mineral tracker, as you'll see in a minute, serves to reinforce that importance of fairness and trust that we heard from the first panel. Firstly, the good news, though, I think it's important that we start by saying that the transition is powering ahead. We have got a transition that is moving fast and forward, and that the enormous human and geopolitical calamity of the Middle East at the moment only serves to speed up that transition and provide greater urgency to this change. It's now only the boneheaded politicians of this world who are either denialists or delay, or asking for delay. And we know who those boneheaded politicians are. However, the fast transition, as was said earlier, is fueling this race for the critical minerals to secure access to those key minerals. And the global competition is being turbocharged both by the extraordinary astronomical investment that's going into data centers, God help us, with artificial intelligence, but then also with this extraordinary shift from ODA into military expenditure. Companies and investors and governments see the chance to make a lot of money. And where we know that money is going to be made fast, we also know it can be a harbinger, too often it's a harbinger, to extraordinary levels of harm, both in terms of human rights and in terms of the environment. And unfortunately, our 2026 tracker really serves to heighten that message. In the last year, three crucial trends can be identified. The first is that the allegations of abuse have skyrocketed, as you're about to see. The second is that too many companies appear to enjoy impunity for riding roughshod over the rights of workers and communities, and that the regulation that is in place is entirely inadequate around the world. And the third message is that inevitably, in the face of that surging abuse, community and worker resistance has ballooned. The resistance is ballooning, and it's more effective, and we'll see a little bit more of that. So this situation for us is a moral failure, but it's also a strategic failure. It's a strategic failure of governments and investors, and unless they can change their approach to one of greater inclusion, our planet is going to continue to warm. So just spending a few moments on the tracker itself. My God, the system works. Marvellous. Firstly, we have 329 new allegations of abuse in 2025, contributing to that total you see up there. That's a shocking increase that we've not seen for the last 7 years, of 73% increase in the allegations of abuse against mining companies. This includes a doubling of violations against workers' rights, and Indigenous communities facing 3 times the average risk that is the risk of most communities. And that's really an indication of the racism that they face as Indigenous communities, but also of the enormous imbalance of power between Indigenous communities and the mining giants. Secondly, you can see, at least in terms of this tracker, who is responsible. I want to highlight, first of all, we are observing, we are one of the few organisations that's putting this information together, but we know it's the tip of the iceberg. There are many more allegations of abuse that we cannot trace. But nevertheless, this gives you an indication about those that are responsible. Corporate accountability remains dangerously weak. 10 companies and 33 mines account for 50% of the allegations you see here. It's led by Glencore, Rio Tinto, and indeed First Quantum. Now, in part, that's because of market dominance. Obviously, these are the largest companies, but that really is no excuse for appearing at the top of this chart. And smaller private companies are also contributing and largely escape accountability, of course. But listen to this. Sadly, from our investigations, close to half of the mines linked to these allegations of abuse lacked even the basic public human rights policies. They have no human rights policies in place in half of the allegations here. Corporate negligence in 2026 at this scale should leave investors scrambling to reduce their risks, and indeed governments racing to regulate for human rights and environmental due diligence. Because, as our third slide shows, this is not the age of imperial dominion or indeed cowering and cap-doffing communities. Thank God, workers and communities often welcome, of course, responsible companies that seek fair negotiations and shared prosperity, but they resist tenaciously irresponsible companies, reckless companies that harm them and their precious environment. And in 2025 alone, 27 mine suspensions, closures and slowdowns were recorded. And crucially for us, 1 in 7 of the allegations that you saw on the previous slide, 1 in 7 of them is linked to strategic litigation or to regulatory action. And that's often linked to Indigenous communities getting organised and insisting that the rule of law applies to them as much to anybody else. In reaction, of course, reckless and ruthless companies respond to this resistance with threats, attacks, and even murder. And so tragically, as you can see here, there's a rise of 50% on the attacks on human rights and environmental defenders, many of them, of course, indigenous peoples. This attempt to silence those critics and close down civic freedoms destroys the voice that companies and investors desperately need to understand the rising problems that they face in their investments, and indeed the abuse that's happening and the resistance that results from them. Oh, I've gone too far, sorry. So in elite international circles at the moment, there is, as you've heard, a profusion of talk amongst mining companies, investors and Western governments, from the G7 to the European Union, essentially of resilient supply chains, of supply security, of standard-based markets. But unless these standards, unless that security, unless that resilience really embeds upstream human rights as its basis, they risk being catastrophic for workers and catastrophic for communities, and drive delay and suspensions in the operations, leading to massive financial losses for companies and investors alike, while also, crucially, squandering public trust for the future. You've only got to witness the enormous losses of Rio Tinto as they have had to abandon their Jadar mine the lithium mine in Serbia, because of ferocious community protests. So I'm going to come back to what will a just transition look like, and we'll come back and have a moment on that before you then give your opinion through the QR codes that you'll see. But first, I want to hand over to our great colleague, Kay Rafitosen, from the Resource Justice Network, who really is leading this extraordinary network of resource justice advocates, and who also are a great partner of the Business and Human Rights Centre, despite our distance geographically. Over to you.
Thanks. Thanks for the flowers, Phil, and for the aircon. And hi, everyone. I am Kay. I'm from Madagascar. I'm from a tropical country, but this heat is striking, I have to confess. And, you know, climate change is real. This is part of what we are living here, and I just hope that having this heat wave in London, on the London Climate Action Week, you know, will send something powerful in terms of messaging and action. We need to act faster, but in the right way. Anyway, congrats for the launch of the tracker. That is a really powerful and very informative tool, I have to say, Phil. And this is a tool that we as communities need to influence policies, but also to tell the right messaging to companies, corporations, and governments on the status of the extraction and beyond, you know. When we speak about critical minerals, generally, Phil, I think that most of the conversation will converge around supply chains, industrial strategy, volume of extraction, resilience, investment, but what the tracker reminds us as well is that behind all of these figures, the statistics, and behind the whole supply chain, there are people and stories of suffering and loss and everything, and we don't have to forget about this reality. Because if we ignore rights, participation, and also this humanity behind the supply chains, then this energy transition won't be just at all. So this is something what we have to keep in mind. And the energy transition, if we forget about the human factor, will become much more slower. It will become more expensive as well. And as you said, Phil, it will become conflict-ridden as well. So how to tackle that? Before getting there, I have to confess, and I took notes that some of the figures that you were speaking about they freaked me out, to be very honest. Because you said, and some of them are still there, you know, more than 1,200 allegations of abuse linked to transition mineral projects since 2010. That's a lot. And only 1 out of 7 of them goes into strategic litigation. That's a high toll of impunity, I have to say. And this is something which is made on the expense of communities. That's not good. You mentioned also 73% increase in those allegations, and I was not surprised. some companies, between brackets, were, in the top 3. I know about it because I come from Madagascar. We've been fighting them for years and we'll keep going. You mentioned also 50% increase in attacks against human rights defenders. This is something that we keep repeating. If we don't protect the people who are claiming for their rights, who are protecting their environment and resources, there won't be any kind of just energy transition. Yes, we will transition, but to something more hellish than today. And you mentioned also indigenous people facing 3 times the risk of abuses. That's a lot. What I wanted to say is that these are not isolated incidents, and this doesn't come as a surprise, unfortunately. They reveal for me a structural problem on how the world is approaching the current transition and the extraction per se, because as someone from a network working closely with communities and activists across the globe, I can tell you that communities don't reject the energy transition. What they do reject is the exclusion, this feeling of being plundered, being used, and deprived from their very own resources. This is what they don't like. So they also reject the fact of being considered as afterthought of conversations and decisions made on their behalf, on their own resources. They are leftovers. That's how people feel, and that's a bias of this transition. That's what we need to correct. And in the previous conversation, our brilliant colleagues spoke about the G7. And we have been following also this with great interest, hoping for something to spring from them. Because, global conversations also feed the realities in the regions at the country level. What we are trying to do is the reverse, bringing the voices from the communities to feed also those conversations. So, as you said, the G7 rightly recognized the importance of securing those supply chains. But then we can ask ourselves a little bit, but security for whom? And I think the previous speaker, Sasha Rab, mentioned it a little bit, most of the time, minerals diplomacy is too much focused on consumer countries' interest and security, and we tend to forget about the producer countries and the people who compose them. So we are focusing on reducing dependence, diversifying suppliers, of course, strengthening competitiveness as well. But, producer countries have a different feeling and perception of this situation. They feel that they are just there to provide the minerals. They will bear the risks. They will bear also the environmental risks and harm and the loss of livelihoods and everything. So, and at the same time, the value creation is going elsewhere. So it's a total waste. What are they gaining? I mean, that's how communities feel about the energy transition. What are we gaining from it? And how can it be really just a win-win scenario? Is that big dream, but will it happen someday? And this is where I think the G20 can bring something on the table, something maybe more constructive, because, the narrative is going to shift. The questions have shifted as well. If we go in the G20 critical minerals framework, for instance, they are asking a question which matters: how can critical minerals or transition minerals contribute to development, instead of just how to secure them? And the shift matters, for local value creation, I would say, for also this transforming this supply chain conversation into something much more sustainable. So this is something to watch. The UK presidency might be transformative if they go in the right way, capitalizing on the gains from South Africa, but that's a big if. That's only if all of us monitor this space and the system and keep repeating those messages. Because one thing, Phil, that I wanted to remind, because this is also something missing in the conversations this week, that's my personal feeling, conversation about who carries the burden of all of those. And most of the time we forget about women. Women carry a lot of the costs of this unjust energy transition, they feel the disproportionate impacts of this mining project, well, they are also not benefiting from economic opportunities. At the same time, all the impacts of the livelihood loss fell on their shoulders, and they are misrepresented, underrepresented in the decision-making around the resources. So, yeah, just like the producer countries, women are also losing everything. And that's the same case for indigenous people, for communities, for workers, for environmental defenders. So this approach is not fair, not sustainable. We need to break it. What I wanted maybe to say last, Phil, is that there is also a big lesson to keep. And this was one of the numbers you mentioned. I took note of it as well. Your tracker records 27 mine suspensions, slowdowns, and closures linked to conflict and grievances. And I think that tells us something that the investors, and I do believe there are some of them in the room, when I think of the run-off show, investors should think of it and stop, considering the respect of human rights as something optional, something that can slow down the investment. On the contrary, the respect of human rights is increasingly becoming a condition of investment success. If you want your project to succeed, listen to communities, respect them, and include them along the full life cycle of the project, not just in a small box. Don't just tick that box. Include them as shapers of this energy transition. That's the main message I think I wanted to carry, really, because projects that fail to secure community consent fail on the longer term. And none of us, I think, have the interest of failing this energy transition, none of us. But it is our practices and how we approach it will make it a success or not. I will stop there, but thanks again for this great case, Phil, and that's really looking forward also to hear the answers on the Mentimeter. Yes. Yeah, keen to see what people think. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Kay. You've highlighted so many critical points there, and particularly that one about gender in the mining situation, where you've got also the dissolution of much of the culture that happens because of the miners who come in and all the culture that comes in behind that. So those are all critical points to make, and thanks very much for that. So before we move to the Mentimeter and your chance to say where you think the investors and government should be really focusing, I thought we thought we should just set the scene a little on this. And because over the years we've consulted with a lot of trade unions, indigenous groups, responsible investors, responsible companies and governments, there is a broad consensus on some of this about three core principles that would guide a better, fairer and faster transition. And so, firstly, there's the issue of responsible business conduct and due diligence. Governments and companies, of course, have a duty of care to shield workers and communities, to deliver due diligence and that minimises human rights and pollution risks, but also creates social protection, retraining, decent work. These are critical to that redistribution that we were talking about earlier. And there are better mining companies. I'll say there's, alongside the bad ones, there's Anglo-American that's joined IRMA that is at least seeking to really embed far better standards than that which is generally available from other mines. And Europe's still intact corporate sustainability due diligence directive is being is an opportunity, but also is being applied and reproduced, or adapted rather, by South Korea, by Thailand, even by Mexico and Indonesia. Secondly, we have the issue of fair negotiation. If there isn't an effort to redistribute power in the negotiation, when you simply impose the transition over an extraordinarily unequal relationship between mining companies and investors on the one hand and communities on the other, you don't be surprised when it ends up with a negotiation that has no longevity and falls to pieces. So getting that fair negotiation is critical. Get free, prior and informed consent is vital to this, as Kay was saying, across the operations life cycle. And I just wanted to add a little here about, you know, this idea of accelerated permitting. I'm very much in favour of accelerated permitting. It's a great thing. And those calls become ever louder, but we need to be clear. There are bureaucratic impediments in permitting that can be and should be removed. Let's remove them immediately. But making community and worker consultation a cursory or an eliminated part of that process and procedure is not accelerated permitting, it is decelerated permitting. The evidence from mines worldwide demonstrates that investment upstream in building trust, in mutual understanding and shared goals with communities and workers is a great accelerator to downstream to the process. And if you ignore it, you build a Gordian knot of trouble for yourself, including those 27 suspensions that were there. Finally, shared prosperity. Effective business models that drive fast transitions will build trust. And if there isn't shared prosperity within it, trust cannot be built, as we've just heard also from Kay and from the previous panel. Communities and workers want to know that their own lives will be enhanced rather than destroyed by the enormous private investment and extraction of a mine. Where communities have rights and subsoil, such as in Canada, far better models of shared prosperity are being developed. And it's encouraging indeed that the renewable energy benchmark that we deliver illustrates that many of those renewable energy companies at the other end of this value chain are actually very much involved in forward thinking, have ambitious shared benefit models that bring communities and workers into upstream project design and build shared prosperity through co-management, even co-ownership and cooperation. Mining companies have a lot to learn there. But now, of course, we're going to move straight to the Mentimeter. And here you'll see the two, oh no, you don't see them. You will see in a moment, two QR codes will appear. Oh, sorry, me, it's my fault. You see now two Mentimeter QR codes. And here you've got, essentially, if you can take a photo of them, you'll then be able to choose between a choice of eight options for action by investors and action by governments. And those will inform the rest of the panel that's coming up. So if you'd like to just have a quick go now, we've got, I think, no minutes left, have we, or 3 minutes left? Are we over or under? 2 minutes left. Okay, so hurry up and have a go at your Mentimeter. And then we'll be able to bring those results into the next panel. Kay, is there any final remark from you just while people are doing that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that I want to influence you, but there is something that I wanted to share as a priority, I guess, for governments and investors. One thing I mentioned already for governments, if you want to ensure this resilience in supply chains, don't forget about the people and to include them in the lifelong cycle of any project, from the design, even before, you know, until the transformation once the mining closes. This is one missing link, I would say. For the governments and the investors, I think there's a need also to reward the good practices. Invest in mining companies which are trying to do the right thing and stop funding those who are wrecking this world. And one thing I think, last word, is community don't want any kind of associations of plunderers, you know, mining alliances who come for extraction only. They want partnerships which are transformative locally, regionally, globally. So yeah, let's think of it. It takes a village to transform it, but this village is here. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Kay. That's great. And from my point of view, I just wanted to highlight that the transition mineral tracker as it stands has been, of course, developed by an enormous amount of hard work from colleagues, particularly led by Carolina Van and Blanca, who are in the audience. But that effort has gone in to making this transition mineral tracker, as you see, over an enormous amount of effort. Thank you very much to everybody. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Phil and Kay. Thank you to all of you for engaging with the Mentimeter. The QR code will remain there over the break in case you haven't had a chance to respond. So we're going to take now 30 minutes to have a drink, talk to each other, see who else is in the room. And we will come back at 3:35, please. And to those of you following us via the live stream, come back in 30 minutes, 3:30 UK time. Enjoy it.
The spotted change the bay. I got dirt and them to the stars. From the corners where my feet still stay within. But the dirt they can't take. The dirt, the dirt, the dirt. I got stories to be. The dirt, the dirt, the dirt, the dirt. I got dirt, and then to the stars. From the corners where my feet still stay with me. The dirt. I got dirt, the dirt, dirt, the dirt, the dirt, the dirt, the dirt. I got dirt, the dirt, the dirt, the dirt, the dirt. The spotted change the pain. I got dirt and then to the stars. From the corners where my feet still stay within. But the dirt they can't take. The dirt.
Welcome back. My name is Gabriela Flores with the Natural Resource Governance Institute. A very warm welcome to those of you who have joined us for this second part of our event, Raw Diplomacy. On behalf of the event organizers, the Business Human Rights Center, Chatham House, Climate Home News, and the Natural Resource Governance Institute, welcome. We're now going to move on to a key part of implementing this agenda, and this has to do with money. So we've got now a brilliant panel prepared for you on finance. And I'm going to leave you with Caroline Avant, who is Head of Natural Resources and Just Energy Transition at the Business and Human Rights Center. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Gabriela, and welcome back, everyone. Welcome to our panel, Can Finance Clean Up Mining, the Role of Investors and Lenders? So in this discussion, we're going to unpack what private investors, institutional investors, as well as public finance and lenders should do. We heard from previous speakers that mining-related harms are still extremely prevalent in transition minerals mining operations. We also heard that the rules of the game and multilateral governments is being decided and the rules are being rewritten or written as we speak. But in this new mining boom and the energy transition, it's opening new opportunities for institutional investors and lenders. And we've heard, for example, recently that European capital is now increasingly moving to investments in mining operations. Public finance is, of course, also getting mobilized. We've heard the call from the G7 countries for multilateral development banks and development institutions to also come in and support these projects. But mining is a high capital industry that presents significant risk for investors and lenders, including supply chain risk. And arguably, only resilient supply chains can be built from responsible mineral operations. We've heard from Kay, for example, that disregarding rights holders is a key condition for failure of mining operations. So a few things just to frame this discussion. The UN and the OECD are clear that investors have their own responsibilities to respect human rights and that it is distinct from those of their investee companies. So using their leverage and engaging with the sector is absolutely crucial. We've heard that the risk of social conflicts compounded with limited governance in many countries can lead to serious risks for operations, which can lead to stranded assets, supply chain disruptions, but also operational and financial losses for investors. And this risk also exists through supply chains as investors may be exposed through their investment in renewable energy technologies, for example. But long-term risks are also important for certain investors, and they may also conflict with the fiduciary duties of certain type of investors, for example, pension funds and sovereign funds. So, for example, we've heard recently of the Norges Bank Investment Management decisions to divest from Eramet, a French company invested in a nickel operation in Indonesia. But conversely, and arguably, underinvestment in the sector could also lead to further risk if the legacy issues of mining operations are not sufficiently financed. In this context, we've also heard from my colleague Phil at the Business and Human Rights Center that there is also a significant increase on the tax against human rights defenders. We see in many mining jurisdictions erosion of civic freedoms that is creating problems in terms of public trust, but also in terms of the type of information that investors will have access to, which should be bad news for them, as they may not have sufficient information to understand the materiality and the impact of certain risks. And finally, multilateral governments. What does that mean for investors? How can they play a role in creating spaces that are truly accountable and can foster more cooperation as opposed to competition? So, to discuss all of this, and that's a very complicated agenda, I'm joined by a fantastic panel. So I will start with Margot Day, just on my left, Accountability Council Executive Director. Accountability Council is a non-profit founded in 2009 with a focus on a very powerful theory of change that is extremely relevant for this conversation, that money is power and that power can be held accountable. People living near and working at mining sites, infrastructure and energy projects and development projects reach out to Accountability Council when those projects have negative environmental and human rights impact, and your organization respond by advising defenders on how to use the accountability mechanisms that are attached to financial institutions to seek to prevent, mitigate, and remediate harms. Based on your experience using those mechanisms, you also advise financial institutions, governments, and companies on how to establish and maintain effective grievance systems. Welcome, Margot, and thank you so much for being with us. Next, Dr. Stephen Barry, who is Deputy Chief Responsible Investment Officer at the Church of England Pensions Board, serving about 44,000 members and managing £3.4 billion saving invested sustainably. But you are also, Stefan, you are also a senior advisor to Mining 2030, which is a collaborative investor-led initiative that's seeking to define a vision for a socially and environmental responsibly mining sector by 2030. And I believe the initiative was created in response to serious controversies in the mining sector, such as the Brumadinho tailing dams disaster in 2019. Pavel, you are also very welcome, and thank you for joining us. You are a financial services professional with 15 years of experience in investment research and management, and now director at the Extractive Industries and the Materials Program at the Emerging Markets Investor Alliance. The Alliance enables institutional emerging market investors to support good governance, promote sustainable development, and improve investment performance in the governments and companies in which invest. And in particular, you look at what's happening in investment in mining companies operating in the global south. So welcome, Pavel Laberko. So we're going to have 2 rounds of questions following initial reactions from our panelists to the previous discussions, and then we will have about 15 minutes, depending on how we do with time, for your questions. So please prepare them. Thank you. Maybe if we can now have a look at the results of the Mentimeter for the question. Yes, perfect. What should be the priority for investors? So we all have to turn a little bit, but I'm going to speak through some of them quickly. So interestingly, the first one is to develop policies and expectations on human rights policies for companies that they invest in. I also see that number 3 is around collective advocacy, which is also a point that we want to discuss today, the power of collective action. But let's come back to these very interesting results as we continue the discussion. So I'm going to start with you, Pavel, if you have a quick reaction to the previous discussions and the two panels that we just heard earlier today.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to this panel and to this event. And yeah, both previous panels were great, all touched upon very important issues and topics. But I actually wanted to quickly reflect on the Mentimeter and say that in my view, some of the points could maybe move up a little bit, but some of the points deserve their place. For instance, number 8, I'm really glad that divesting from the sector is at its lowest place, because first of all, given the ongoing energy transition, we all will need more and more minerals. And secondly, if investors divest from the sector, it will still be owned by someone, but responsible investors will not have any leverage and any opportunity to improve anything in these companies. So that's good that it's at number 8. And then I would highlight number 6, support and promote voluntary standards and certification schemes. I think it's actually very important because in many countries, especially in the global south, the local regulation and laws are not adequate, and the only thing that companies should follow is actually good and strong voluntary standards to close this gap with inadequate local regulation. And then I also think that number 5, adopt responsible investment and lending policies to support engagement. It's actually very important, because if investors and investment firms do not have responsible investment policies, then it's not quite clear what their goals are. So I think that actually should be the first step in the process of improving the sustainability of their investments.
Thank you so much, Pavel, for this initial reaction. Can I go to you, Margot, now for your reactions to previous discussion or possibly to the Mentimeter as well?
Yeah, thank you. So investments in the mining sector are outpacing accountability is my big takeaway. And specifically, I mean accountability to people who are living near and working at mining sites. But what we what I took away from the earlier conversations is, although that's the case, there are bright spots. There's proof of concept where investors have been more responsible. There's indigenous and local communities who have organized and been able to successfully defend their rights and their lives and their livelihoods and their environments. And so what I'm excited about to hear from co-panelists and to share as well are ways that we can build on those successes, and many of which I think are up here on the Mentimeter as well. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Margot, and definitely agree with a lot of what you said. Stephen, can I turn to you now for your initial reaction?
Thanks. So there are clearly structural barriers to responsible mining. And that's one of the motivations behind Mining 2030, the Global Investor Commission on Mining 2030, which is an investor-led but multi-stakeholder initiative that over the last 2 years or so has tried to understand the mining industry, that we produced a landscape report in 2024, and tried to understand investors' role in potentially driving a responsible mining sector over the next 10 years. And the process was deliberately a bit self-reflexive, so it was thinking about the ways that investors can contribute to the problem as much as we want to contribute to the solutions in the future. So structural barriers led to this multi-stakeholder process, which included affected communities, included mining companies themselves, it included a big range, a range of people, and reinforced the need for collaboration. No one stakeholder has all the answers, and no one stakeholder has all the solutions. It's going to be investors working with governments, working with local communities, and working with mining companies that come to a practical way forward. We managed to gather quite a big range of investors, so 120 institutions with about 18 trillion AUM, which shows the level of interest and kind of importance that investors put on responsible mining. We need about 300 new mines to meet the demands of the climate transition. So this is not just a legacy question. This is where's the capex going? What are the new mines what are the characteristics going to be like, and how are they being planned for over the whole life cycle? So collaborative, multi-stakeholder, very important, and it's important that investors are at the table as well.
Thanks a lot, Stefan. Actually, so I want to stay with you to open our first round of questions. The Mining 2030 Commission has acknowledged, and you've just mentioned it, that minerals have impact, and in particular on indigenous people's rights. Interestingly, you've also commissioned a survey undertaken by Globoscan on your behalf last year that showed that 81% of mining sector respondents said that support from investors is crucial to drive improvements in their own sustainability policies and standards. So confirming that, in fact, investors do have leverage on mining companies, and that's absolutely crucial. So you outline in your vision several options that investors can use, including capital allocation and active stewardship with an engagement with current investees. So if we focus on that, how can investors build their understanding of the issues before they decide to invest in mining companies, and while they also continue their engagement with current investee companies?
Great. And I'm afraid I'm going to let you down, not just because I'm a below average speaker, but because it's very hard to communicate a thorough process that's resulted in a long document that has been very carefully written for a multi-stakeholder process. So summarizing the outputs of Mining 2030 are very difficult. But it's great to see that setting expectations was right at the top of the Mentimeter for investors to do. And the Global Investor Commission on Mining 2030 sets investor expectations for mining companies and for value chain companies and for good stakeholder engagement and for benefit sharing. The investor expectations go through a range of fairly familiar topics, including transparency, continuous improvement, good governance, precautionary approach, robust stakeholder engagement, the kind of things you'd expect an investor to be speaking to their good companies about. But we also have in the forward look over the way that we think that investors will take Mining 2030 over the next couple of years. leaning into the role of performance standards. So we think there's a huge opportunity for investors to reinforce and to use mining performance standards, whether that's IRMA or the forthcoming consolidated mining standard that's coming out, to use those as part of your investment decision making and part of the stewardship tools. So that there's more to say there. Mining 2030 is working on a framework that will kind of sit above the different audit and assurance standards and bring that into an investable data set. That was a great meeting in Edinburgh last month where we kicked off that process. But I'll leave it there because I'm rambling.
Thanks. Maybe can I ask just a quick follow-up questions, which is still about how investors identify risks in their own portfolio. And do you think there's a difference in the way investors approach issues in the mining sector as short-term risk, but also maybe do not think enough about the long-term risk, or is it the other way around? So how is that distinction between the short-term and the long-term being approached by different investors?
That's a very good question. I think because mining is is a cyclical industry, because permitting takes average of 25 years, because the time horizons of a mining project include structures that are going to be there in perpetuity, like tailings facilities, and going to need managing, going to need a careful approach. I think the mining sector is a classic example of the need for a long-term approach that attends to externalities. Investors in general covers a multitude of sinners. So from your development banks that are looking at a project by project, through to a portfolio investor that's got exposure to a passive index and just finds mining companies in there because of the index rules. And the way different kinds of decisions are made depend on the kind of investor that you are. Generally, it's hard to make generalizations, but generally investors tend to be fairly short-term focused in terms of looking at quarterly reports, in terms of looking at annual stewardship reports. But I think as a sector, there's definitely long-term systemic characteristics that Mining 2030 try to focus on.
Thanks a lot. Definitely important to think about this risk as systemic issues. I want to turn to you now, Pavel. You support investors in establishing dialogues with the companies they engage with. So I have a two-part question, and also building on maybe some elements that Stefan has already shared. How can investors avoid reinforcing a model that prioritizes short-term profits over resilience and accountability in the long term? And what makes a difference between investor engagement that actually changes company behavior from engagement that remains largely procedural? Where should investors draw the line? Should they stay in, or should they sometimes consider divestment from the companies through which they are exposed to mining risks? Complicated question, sorry.
Yeah, I'll start with the first part. So, I think the way the question is formulated, particularly, it's a difficult one because investors and their clients, they do need to see financial returns. And let's not forget that many clients of investment managers are just ordinary people like you and me who want to preserve their hard-earned savings and hopefully beat inflation, see some financial return to offset the inflation. So financial returns are important. I would suggest we reframe the question a little bit and see it from the point of view of risks. Resilience and accountability, they don't have to be on the other side of financial returns, because we know many examples when unsustainable and irresponsible practices lead to direct financial losses. And I can give a few examples. The lack of FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, has been known to lead to delays and cancellations in mining projects. For example, the Southern Copper's 1.8 billion mining project at Arequipa region has faced over a decade of delays, and due to strong local opposition regarding the water and environmental impacts. So clearly the company and its investors have suffered significant losses. Then tailings dam breaches and other similar incidents, they can lead to fines and penalties, to compensations. For example, the collapse of Fundão Dam in Brazil, where resettlement and remediation costs again came in billions of US dollars for companies involved. Then there is also an issue of sales and access to export markets, where companies with poor disclosure or inadequate decarbonization or other social policies, they can just be unable to sell their products into specific markets. And as an example, there is the EU battery regulation, which comes into force next year, where all industrial and EV batteries that come into the market will have to have a digital battery passport, which must include information about the battery's carbon footprint and raw materials origin, causing the traceability which will be required. And manufacturers and suppliers of metals will have to carry out due diligence along the supply chain to ensure compliance with OECD and UN human rights guidance and principles, identify environmental and social risks, and also undergo an independent audit, which is important. Then lack of climate adaptation can also lead to increasing physical risks for mining companies' operations, and we can look at Chile, for example, where consistent droughts are making companies to make significant investments in desalination plants. And finally, labor policies. If they allow for forced labor or inadequate remuneration below the living wage, poor health and safety practices, this can only lead to low engagement from the side of their employees and hence poor productivity. So we need to really reframe the question and make sure that investors and companies are all on the same page. Sustainable and responsible mining practices are a way to avoid many of these real risks and financial losses. And moving to the second part of the question, I would say rather briefly that we at EMIA, we believe in engagement and dialogue that builds trust and confidence. And we think that this is the most effective way to bring about change that is in the interest of all stakeholders. We think that investors and companies should really work together to build and run successful businesses over the long term, preserving their value. And of course, if this trust and understanding does not exist, and if the companies are unwilling to make any change, yes, indeed, there are other escalation techniques, including divestment. But I think that's probably the last step in this escalation process. And we at the EMIA, we don't go that way. We try to focus on dialogue and trust.
Thanks. Maybe a quick follow-up question very quickly. Do you see that this trust exists often, or is it difficult to achieve through the type of dialogues that you facilitate between investors and companies? How do you see this moving forward?
So from our experience, we see different situations. On the one hand, some companies don't even want to meet with us and discuss sustainability issues. Some companies answer to some questions, but give some vague answers which are close to greenwashing, I would say. But then there are also companies which are very open to dialogue, which are interested to hear what investors want from them. They also ask questions. They really participate in the dialogue. So it's a long process. We can't really expect to see a lot of change after just one meeting or one email. So it's a range, but I'm hopeful that, seeing many companies are being open to investor engagement, and I'm hoping for the future. Yeah.
Thank you. So quite hopeful, which is good. So we've discussed private finance, institutional investors. I want to turn now to Margot for a question about public finance. You work alongside communities and rights holders who have been harmed by projects funded by multilateral development banks and development finance institutions. We know that they are, I've already mentioned it, they are increasingly pivoting towards capital support to the mining sector. The World Bank in particular has recently announced that they are launching a new mineral strategy and will indeed increase their support. The question, Margot, is how do you respond to that increased focus? Where do you see accountability gaps and urgent actions that these public banks and development institutions should take to ensure that when harm occurs in projects that they fund, that access to remedy is effective?
Thank you. So people living near and working at mining sites have been telling investors what they want for a very long time. And so we'll start there, not as a way to be righteous or anything, but simply to affirm that the problems and the harms from mining and mineral processing are known, and communities have told investors what they want prevented, mitigated, and remediated. So as Phil was mentioning with the mineral tracker, communities have used all types of different channels to defend their rights. Where Accountability Council focuses is when communities try to reach investors directly through the accountability mechanisms or the grievance mechanisms that are set up at the investor level. So when it's unsafe or futile or impossible to raise something in your local context, you should be able to reach up to the investor and say your environmental and your social rules aren't being followed. And when we look at the 2,420 complaints that communities have brought to investors, and then we narrow those to ones that are about mining or extractives, it probably won't surprise people in this room that the most common things that are raised are harms to health and safety, to pollution. There's either water overuse or there's water contamination or both, displacement, both physical and economic, and then negative impact or loss of livelihoods. And you see those across, multiple different complaints from communities living in multiple different contexts with mining of different minerals. And maybe more systemically across these, and this is kind of getting, I think, to what Kay was saying earlier, is that there's exclusion of the people who bear the most risk when harms occur and also are the experts in their local context and know what responsible and sustainable mining would look like. So in 40% of the community-driven cases to investors, communities say there was inadequate due diligence, and in over a third of the cases, they're saying there was inadequate consultation and disclosure. So nobody told us, nobody asked us, and what stems from there are those substantive harms that I talked about. And so it's why I started in my first reflection with this sentiment that the investment's outpacing accountability, and it has for a long time. But there is, opportunity and a good track record with some investors to be able to change that. And so I think the two gaps that I'll mention in response to your question, or rather the calls to action for investors, are one, all investors in the mining sector should have these channels to hear directly from communities. That gives investors the opportunity to prevent, mitigate, and remediate harms and have more sustainable mining practices. So that's kind of binary. You either have a way to hear from the people you're impacting or you don't, and you should. And then also investors should be planning for remedy up front, because there's no mining or mineral processing that doesn't contribute to some harm. It's just harm that's often externalized onto people and the planet. And so we would call for investors holding back a percentage of an investment, specifically with project finance. I think it's easier to conceptualize there. So hold back a percentage for if there's negative environmental and social impacts. If there is, you have a fund ready for it. If there isn't, then you can disperse it because the client or the implementer did such a great job that they can then get the rest of the loan. I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Margot. And I actually want to stay with you as we are moving towards the second round for this panel discussion. We've discussed the type of actions that different actors should take or could take, and the difficulties also. And there's also a bigger question in terms of what should they do to influence the ecosystem that they operate in, and what should they do in terms of their engagement with governments, with multilateral governance as well, and influence that sort of system-level change that is possibly needed to tackle these really persistent mining-related harms. So staying with you, you raised the alarm that investment can outpace accountability, and I would say that that's definitively what we also see in our work at the Business and Human Rights Center. We also know that some investors and companies are committing to greater responsibilities for environmental and social impacts of mining. And this also includes stronger commitments from Chinese governmental agencies and mining companies. And of course, we know of Chinese domination of global supply chains of minerals. So could you share a little bit about some of the advancements you've seen recently? Anything that gives you hope in particular?
Yeah, there's so much promise, right? And what we're excited about is this opportunity for commitments on paper to really be moving into practice. And here I think I'll call back to what people were saying on the first panel and refer again to the Chinese Business Association, the CCCMC. It houses the Responsible Critical Minerals Initiative, which has recently launched a mining mediation mechanism. So when I was talking about those type of accountability mechanisms where communities can directly reach investors, in this case, communities who believe that they are negatively impacted by Chinese mining operations can reach a centralized business association in Beijing and say, the environmental and the social standards, the due diligence guidelines that you have in place aren't being followed, and we want to sit down with the company and mediate a solution. And this is incredibly exciting in that it fills a governance and accountability gap where often communities who are seeking to protect their rights and environment can't reach someone who will respond to them, right? And in this case, we have this extra level of governance where it's sitting at that kind of secretariat level and communities can raise issues. And we're at this really pivotal, both exciting and kind of like fearful moment in that this mechanism that's existed on paper for a while is now real and in practice. And 2 different communities have filed initial complaints to it, and we've heard from many more who are considering raising issues there. So we're in this moment of testing, right? Like, couldn't this be a way for us to have some structured space to actually mediate and resolve and hopefully set better practices for mining operations in a way that really brings communities to that table and hopefully build some of that and connects on some of that trust gap that you were talking about. We're bringing people in like a mediated and regulated space can be good. So really excited about that. I'll mention that it builds, at least in my mind, on earlier guidelines from the Chinese government, the green finance guidelines that actually calls for all Chinese investors and insurers to set up these type of accountability channels, but we've yet to see too much uptake in practice. And so again, these promises that there should be these governance mechanisms that are community-centered, if those get implemented in a thoughtful, inclusive, community-driven way, I think we would see a significant change and a stronger proof of the way that responsible mining can be done. And then I'll just close too and maybe bring it back to what you were saying at the start, connecting back to the multilateral development banks and the G7 statement. You know, in the multilateral development banks in that statement said that they were going to commit to the best standards of environmental and social protections and accountability and transparency, which is music to my ears, and excited that that commitment is in that statement, and then it begs the question of what it would mean in practice. And one thing I think the multilateral development banks can build on is One of them, the International Finance Corporation, the private sector arm of the World Bank, has a remedial action framework. It actually has a policy in place that says we acknowledge that there can be negative environmental and social impacts, and there needs to be some remedial commitments and some remedial process to people on the planet when those occur. But no other multilateral development bank has since adopted that, not even its public side sister, even as the IFC and the World Bank are merging on a lot of things. So the World Bank can be next, and then the rest of the banks that signed that statement can also commit to the remedial action framework and start to put that in practice, not only for mining, but across their portfolios.
Thanks, Margot. So hopefully some developments, but also many accountability gaps that still need to be filled, and for MDBs to really play a role in advancing responsible mining. If we now think about, that was on the responses from the Mentimeters. Like number 3 was the power of collective action. And so actually that's a very good question for Stefan, sorry. You have also proposed to engage, as part of the Commission, to engage with policymakers and support the strengthening of institutional and regulatory frameworks for the sector, so as a group, and so using the power of a collective action by a large number of institutional investors. Where do you see the biggest gaps, and what are the priorities in terms of the ask of government, of investors to governments to fill the gaps in their regulatory frameworks on mining?
What a question. What's the most important policy change? So I'm going to start with a really positive story of collective action that has moved from soft regulation to hard regulation. So after the Brumadinho disaster, this is back in the Investor Mining and Tailings Safety Initiative, we collaborated with ICMM, the industry body, and with the UN Environment Programme to create a new global standard on tailings management. We then integrated that into our stewardship processes, so voted against the chairs of companies that didn't adopt the standard, and advocated for that to be the industry standard for tailings facilities. It's been great to see that incorporated into hard law, hard regulation in Brazil, and I know it's under consideration in other jurisdictions. So that move from an investor challenge to the industry immediately after a disaster, backed by a coalition of about 24 trillion AUM, supported by industry, supported by the UN, turning into a norm in the mining sector, and then a regulation is a great story in terms of a theory of change and a move from soft power to a hard-edged accountability. There's a huge amount more work to do. So ICMM's report back in November showed that only a bit more than 80% of their extreme hazard and very high hazard facilities are in full conformance with the standard, and that's a number of years after it was released, so there's more work to do. But I think the story of a voluntary commitment into regulation is a positive story to hear. Mining 2030 has kind of taken that lesson and thought more about it. And the report, the recommendations report, which I recommend to you to read, includes some advocacy in favour of an international minerals agency that should be established, a bit like the IEA, but with a global remit to focus on forecasting, transparency in the sector, to focus on illicit financial flows, which can contribute to the drivers of conflict, not least in the DRC, Eastern DRC, to encourage good governance, good regulation, and to consider and to help structure financial instruments. So working with MDBs that can help risk sharing to structure instruments that encourage responsible mining and fund it effectively. I think that's one of the key things that we've heard from mining companies, is that it can sometimes be hard to make the case for all of the extra spend that you need for responsible practices, and they don't see a premium on responsibly produced minerals and metals. But I think it's up to investors and governments to respond to that challenge and to demonstrate that actually we do value responsibly produced minerals, and that can be seen. I mean, we know that insurers will offer lower premia for a tailings facility, for example, that is operated to a very high standard. So we're starting to see some financial advantage, and I think building that into the culture of an international minerals agency would be a hugely helpful theory of change in terms of driving responsible practices. There's a lot more to say. Yeah.
Maybe just a quick follow-up question on the International Mineral Agency you've mentioned. How do you think it will be articulated with other mechanisms that exist or that are being developed at the international level? We've also heard from Sasha earlier today about the new NSG panel led report on critical energy transition minerals. We know that's also another mechanism that the UN is developing. UNIDO is also working on its own initiative. So how do you see this International Mineral Agency sort of the interplay with other mechanisms, which, as I was saying earlier, like everything is being written as we speak, but how do you see this coming together?
No doubt it would reinforce all of the good things from those initiatives that are out there, and supply a deep level of kind of credibility and ambition at that global level. So it's a recommendation rather than a fully worked out political play. It's a recommendation that as institutional investors with long-term investment time horizons, so some of our members are going to be receiving their pensions in the 22nd century, we've got very long-term time horizons. With that kind of investor in mind, we see the value of that global, that kind of global institution. So we're articulating that, and there's a huge amount to work out in terms of how it works with all of the different actors. We've been encouraged, thinking about Prime Minister Mark Carney's Middle Powers speech. There may be a really interesting role for middle powers here if we're moving into a more multipolar world. Some of the middle powers are significant mineral producing countries, and that might help a framing for this kind of work. But this is early days, but a clear recommendation from Mining 2030.
Thank you. Very interesting. If we're staying on the power of collective action now, turning back to you, Pavel, you work for an alliance. And the question that I have for you is, what role do you think investor alliance can play in raising expectations on mining companies in ways that individual investors often cannot? So that's the interplay between investors and companies. You mentioned, for example, the importance of free, prior, and informed consent. Do you think that collective ask by investors are more powerful than individual investor? And also, if you want to speak about how investors collectively could engage or should engage with governments, especially where regulatory frameworks are weak. Stefan has already mentioned the role of standards, so that's maybe something you want to pick up on too.
Okay, so two questions for me again.
Two questions
Start
again.
with the first one, as usually. So I think there are a few practical advantages for investors to join forces and join alliances. I will probably use our work at EMIA as the basis. So how we can help investors? First of all, it's shared knowledge. So we organize different educational events and invite experts from various areas of sustainability to provide some knowledge to investors, and that should help them to be more effective in their conversations with companies. Then we also provide technical and organizational support. We set up meetings, organize contacts with companies, we follow up, organize regular meetings, follow up with emails. So that also saves some time and effort for both companies and investors. And then, of course, we unite forces of several investors who are looking at the same companies and are interested in the same issues. One investor having a very small, tiny stake will probably have less influence on a company as opposed to a group of investors with a larger stake. And the company will see that they are not just listening to some individual investor, but this is a view, a question from a group of investors. So it has much more weight in their eyes. And it also helps the participating investors to share their views and best practices, which is also often useful. And by doing all these things, we help investors to ask the right questions, making sure everyone at the table, including companies, understands what the priorities are, what the targets and the next steps will be. So that's about the advantages that we see for the initiatives. And then for the second question about engaging with governments, we think that the government action is very important for just and fair transition for the mining industry, because companies very often they look at local governments for guidance and support in their operations. You know, investors holding government debt, they have this unique opportunity to engage with governments. And they do. And many governments are repeated issuers. So in many cases, it's a process whereby investors can initiate and continue dialogue with governments. It's particularly relevant when countries issue labeled bonds, sustainability-linked bonds or use of proceed bonds, where investors can help them to set up proper KPIs and targets in line with best practices in the industry. I think that's
Thank you. I think you wanted to quickly comment, Stefan, before we start the question.
Just to reinforce the importance of collaborative initiatives, I think they have a role. Collaborations have a role in the investment ecosystem that is distinctive and can be very powerful. Mining 2030 has produced its recommendations report, but the next phase is the implementation phase and is open for investor supporters. So just a quick plug for an ambitious, but we think well-founded collaborative initiative that's going to be working on some of these topics over the next couple of years. A plug, sorry.
Thank you. No, very well, very good addition. We've done quite well on time, which is good. So we do have some time for questions from the audience. So if there are any questions, there is one mic that Gabriela has in her hands. There is one question.
Sure. Hi there. Hello, my name is Rowan. I play at Meta Systems Change with an entity called Blue Dot Integration Lab. I'm going to share a little bit about my background just because of the nature of the question, which is a bit controversial. So I'm an ex-regional board director of a multinational bank, and I'm also a 3-jurisdictional corporate lawyer. And why do I say that? Is because the question I'm going to ask hammers the current capitalist corporate context. And Stefan, in particular, whilst I recognize the deep value that you guys are adding, including the Church of England, as well as the various investors, what I'm seeing is a metaphorical downstream tailings approach. In other words, where you are fixating, which is part of your hypnosis, is on some of the downstream harms that mining as a conventional legacy from 1700s continues to do, which is effectively asset stripping. And what my invitation as an investor is none of the hypnoses that you put on the board either. You go upstream and you ask yourself very simple questions, which is what does an appropriate realignment of financial value look like in the entire value chain of the relevant product that is being extracted? particularly in this phase where we are talking about quantum and AI raw materials, where we're seeing the most radical concentration of risk in the history of humankind, or not so kind in some instances. What does that look like for investors to step up to the plate and say, guys, you know, a 1 to 3% share of that value chain in those industries in producer countries, and then 40, 50, 60% further up the value chain is obscene. That's where I'm inviting your attention to go.
Maybe you want to respond first before we take more questions? I don't know. Yeah.
You make some very good points about the fairness, the general fairness of the systems within which we operate, and that we don't just operate within, but through the way that we invest and the way that we steward our assets, we contribute to shaping those structures and mechanisms. So I agree with you very much that we shouldn't just take the market as a given and as an immutable structure that we respond to only. I think investors, in particular institutional investors and governments, have a role in thinking about what those markets should look like in the future. The thinking behind Mining 2030 is to look at what our investor responsibilities are. So fairly fundamental. What are our responsibilities in contributing positively towards a more responsible mining sector in the future? I hope we haven't been hypnotized along the way by a nefarious hypnotist for unfettered capitalism. But nor do I hope also we're not afflicted by a kind of wishful thinking that radical systems change is possible overnight. I think we try to strike this balance between working within the system that we have and being as ambitious as we possibly can to build new kinds of coalitions, to think very carefully about the theories of change that we have available to us as investors, and the accountability architecture. And it's building on points that both of my fellow panelists have made, is how can we contribute to that accountability architecture that can help. So it's a fairly rambling question to what is indeed a provocative question that raises important points. So.
Thank you so much for this very important question indeed. Yes, I see someone in the back.
Daniel Willis from Recourse. Thanks for a great panel. We're particularly interested in Recourse at the role of the public development banks. And at the minute, particularly looking at the review of IFC's sustainability framework and performance standards, which, although they're kind of not sector specific, are highly relevant and cover a lot of these issues like pollution and health impacts and land and resettlement. But one thing that we always hear back from IFC when we talk to them is that they, public banks, although they are highly influential, that they need, particularly IFC because they invest in the private sector, they kind of need to meet their clients where they're at and meet the private sector where they're at. So really interested to hear from Pavel in particular, how can we maybe sort of call their bluff a little bit on that, and how might the private sector actually be a really kind of positive force for influencing the public banks to increase their standards and in line with some of the initiatives like IRMA and others. Thanks.
Good question. I think that engagement with governments is important, and we do that at EMIA. We work with governments of emerging markets on improving their regulatory environment. We also engage with financial institutions, banks, on various issues, improving the sustainability approaches. And yes, we also do support high quality mining standards, voluntary mining standards, such as the IRMA standard. And I'm happy to see Bob Walker here in the audience. I'm sure you can ask more questions to him about the standard. Yes, that's him. Yeah, so I guess that's the answer from my part. Using all these levers, hopefully we can improve the regulatory environment and support good standards. I don't know if anybody wants to add. No.
Indeed, important point. You've mentioned that you support IRMA as the best available standard for investors to also ask of their mining companies. So that's one way to also maybe raise the bar for the IFC performance standards review in taking inspiration from IRMA. Yes, another question.
My name is David Perkey. I work at the Stockholm Environment Institute's Latin America Center in Bogota. And Stefan, you mentioned that companies are reluctant to invest in all this accountability and responsibility because they do not identify that there's a market value for them to do so, that they can't differentiate that product. I think you mentioned that in some of your comments. So what would be the steps that would be required to sort of change the dynamics of the marketplace so that there was a premium placed on making those investments to produce responsibly? Is it the consumer's decision? Is it the regulatory framework? Is there a marketing campaign? What is it that's going to drive that extra value addition that would come from responsible production?
It's a great question. The remarks I made were around companies reflecting on how they make the case internally for robust, responsible practices, and the best practitioners will make a case in terms of access to resources, access to capital, access to talent. They think about access to markets, access to shorter permitting times, better relationships with governments and regulators. So they'll talk about kind of softer features of being recognized as a responsible practitioner. Something that would unlock responsible practices right across the industry would be a premium for responsibly assured sites, for example, or that kind of thing. So how do we unlock that? It's one of the chapters in the Mining 2030 work is around how do we build momentum around allocating to responsible mining. And I think that's going to be an ongoing piece of work. It's around socializing norms, socializing within the investment industry, thinking about carefully about risk mitigation, that we want risk-adjusted returns over longer time frames that mining operates. So I don't have a snappy answer for you, but yeah, it's part of the project of Mining 2030 to think carefully about the levers of change, the theories of change, the levers that can be used.
Yeah, perhaps I can add actually. You might be interested in a recent report from the Rocky Mountain Institute where they estimated the additional cost that companies incur if they want to implement responsible mining practices. And they looked at several projects, talked to investors and companies, and they came up with the average number of 0.4% of the total project outlay, which a company has to spend if they want to make it responsible in line with best practices. So if you compare it with potential losses from incidents that I've already mentioned, it's really not such a big number. So that's one comment that I can make. And also, we see practices from buyers that push mining companies to improve the sustainability and the responsible practices of their businesses. For example, BMW, I know, they are now requiring their suppliers to do due diligence along the value chain to make sure that the metals that they are buying are not produced with violations of human rights and are independently audited. So there are good examples in this area.
How do we unlock the premium that could be gained from being able to document that? Because if it doesn't cost much and the premium is substantial, that should be an incentive for that sort of change, in my thinking.
Margot, you want to maybe respond as well?
I was just going to build, actually, maybe connecting your question to Dan and Rowan's too. So kind of to me, I'm hearing questions around like the business case now and the incremental incentive changes, and then also this, at least I'll speak for myself, like a need for more of a revolutionary change and systemic change as well. So I think we've heard panelists and on the other panels have made really artful business case for responsibility and accountability. And then a recognition that there are incentives that would need to change. I think that question about the IFC brings that up too, of just who's really has the power, who's moving the market, who's responding to the market, kind of raising some of those incentives. But I guess I'll just reflect big picture for where we're sitting is that I don't think you're gonna have more responsibility without some pain and some cost. And right now, at least from who we hear from, like that pain and cost tends to be indigenous and local communities and local environments that are kind of bearing that risk. And so how do we put that cost onto the balance sheet as opposed to have it being externalized? And so there's, we can now go for many more days and many more panels with all the different ways we could campaign for that. But just to say, like, accountability is going to go against the system, and so there's going to have to be some like major powerful institutions that are going to have to pay some money and I think feel some pain for us to kind of get to the, at least the vision that we would like to set.
Perfect. Can we maybe just take a quick look at the results for the Mentimeter on governments? What should be the priority for governments to close off this panel, as we've had a discussion on, what investors and public financial institutions should ask of governments. Okay, so number one is excellence. Pass and enforce new legislation mandating human rights and environmental due diligence for mining companies and companies sourcing minerals. Just very quickly, as we have run out of time, do you have any ask that you will be, if you had one ask for governments and policymakers, what would it be? Margot, you can start first.
Sure, just, increased enforced regulation. I'll just leave it there, consistent with number one. Yeah.
Stefan?
I think, yes, regulation, but also I'd encourage governments that I was speaking to consider the way they're working with international investment institutions, companies, and local stakeholders, and how is there a multi-stakeholder approach being brought into the decision making?
Pavel?
I would suggest the governments to use the best voluntary mining standards as the model, because that would make their regulation in line with best practices, and also it would make them a little more unified across the regions and globally if they try to follow the same set of best practices.
Thank you so much for this fantastic discussion. We are out of time, so I will hand over back to you, Gabriela. Thanks again.
Thank you very much to Caroline, Margot, Stephen, and Pavel for this great discussion. And we're nearing the end of our time together. Very sad, I know. But we have now a great final panel, which is really looking at the big question for all of us, and has to do with how do we build genuinely equitable mineral partnerships. And for that, I invite back to Chloe Ferran from Climate Home News, who is going to lead this final discussion for us. Chloe.
see you again. Thank you. Brilliant. Thanks so much, Gabriela. Thank you to Caroline. I thought that was a really interesting discussion on finance, actually. I thought that touched on a lot of like nitty-gritty issues that we don't usually hear about. So thank you so much for that discussion. And so glad that you're still here with us. I know it's kind of late in the day and we've had lots already. But hopefully you can, keep switched on for this last little bit of a conversation because I think it's going to be an interesting one. So as Gabriela says, we're going to be asking, what should these equitable mineral partnerships actually look like? And how can regional coordination and also principles of the circular economy help to deliver these win-win partnerships that we're hearing so much about? And I think there's been references earlier in some of the panels on export restrictions and also on regional coordination, so we're going to get into some of that. So I'm delighted to welcome another fantastic lineup of speakers today. So directly to my left is Wenyu Wang, who's the executive lead on critical minerals for the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which works on promoting the ideas and principle around circular economy. Next is Thomas Skerfield, who's Africa Senior Economic Analyst at NRGI. Next to him, we have Eric Ngang, from a lead strategist at the African Coalition on Green Minerals, and he also works at African Resources Watch, AfroWatch. And then we're delighted to have join us online. Thank you so much for making time. Tobias Musonda, who's Director of Policy and Planning at the Zambia Ministry of Mines. And hopefully, Tobias, you can hear us okay?
Precisely, I'm able to get you. Thank you.
Fantastic. So pleased that the connection can be made. So Tobias, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. Zambia is Africa's second largest copper producer after the DRC, and the government has set out an ambition to triple copper output to reach 3 million tons by 2031. And the government is currently holding talks and looking for investments with different countries to try and achieve that vision. Can you tell us a little bit about how that's going, and what are you expecting or demanding from investors so that that mineral partnerships or those investments can actually be win-win and bring benefits to Zambia?
Thank you very much, and we appreciate for being given this platform to be part of this panel discussion. I think it's important for me to indicate that mining is the bedrock of Zambian economy. And when the new government came into place in 2021, they straight went into undertaking reforms to increase production, particularly in the production of copper, but also other mineral commodities. So one of the key aspects that we set to do was to achieve the 3 million metric tons of copper production so that the country can benefit from the green transition and decarbonization agenda. So we're looking at investment in the brownfield mining companies, but also in green fields. Obviously, there are quite a number of players that we are speaking to ensure that the country can attain the targets that it has set to achieve by 2031. I'm aware that one of the key issues, again, that we did undertake is to put in place a stable and predictable environment so that then we can attract credible investment in the mining sector. It is important to note that we have since received quite a huge investment in the green and brown fields. As I speak, the figures point to the fact that we've so far from 2021 attracted about $12 billion in terms of investment. So in terms of the cost that we're undertaking, I think the country is on course. Various mining companies that we are speaking to that have expressed interest to work on their own, but also partner with government so that our targets that we have set to achieve can benefit the Zambian people. But obviously, we are also looking at sustainable and responsible mining practices. And as such, we expect the investment that is coming our way to abide by our investment requirements, ensure that there is sustainability, but also to ensure that they have capacity in undertaking projects from exploration into production, as it were. So far, I think the indication looks very okay from where we stand as government of the Republic of Zambia to actualize our targets, but also to ensure that we ramp up investment in mineral beneficiation and value addition. Essentially, I think that's how the picture looks like. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I can just follow up on that, when you mentioned value addition, can you give us a little bit more information about exactly the conversations, the type of conversations you're having with maybe interested potential investors or foreign companies or even foreign governments looking at investing in Zambia? Is it the case that you are asking for some form of technology transfer, for example, so that Zambia has ambitions to go up the value chain? Is that something that you're directly demanding from investors and potential companies, for example, that you're speaking to?
Yes, so essentially the policy drive by the government of the Republic of Zambia is to see investment in facilities that has to do with value addition, and also in terms of ensuring that there's technology, but also skills that will be able to support government policy in terms of mineral beneficiation and value addition. But we're also trying to assure them that the investment climate will generally remain stable and very predictable, because I think the past couple of years, the stability has been an issue, but I think we seem to have found the formula in ensuring that we have stability in the mining sector, the tax regime is stable, and over the last 5 years, we've been very consistent, and that's the reason why we see investment pouring in the green fields and also in the brown fields, but not only in the mine, in the copper value chain, but also in other mineral commodities such as nickel, where we have seen ramping up of production by one of the big mining companies in the country. So essentially, those are the areas we are looking at: the skills, technology, but also from our side as government to ensure that enablers such as power, telecommunication, and general infrastructure development is brought up to speed so that it enables investment from the mining sector, as it were. Thank you.
Thank you. And I should just add that some of you will have seen in the press lots of reports around Zambia and its negotiations with the US government, both on minerals and also on a health aid package. But Mr. Musonda today is unable to directly comment to those negotiations. So just wanted to acknowledge that this is definitely something that is ongoing, but we won't quite go there today. But Eric, can I bring it to you next? Building on what Tobias has just said, it should be on the mic, hopefully. Building on what Tobias has just said, what does these, for you, what does mutually beneficial partnerships that we keep talking about, or win-win, or, what does that mean concretely on the ground for African countries, for resource-rich African countries? What do you expect to see that translate into?
Thank you, Chloe. That's a very important question. And before I take a deep dive into that, I want to say from the context I come from, when we talk about partnerships, we are always tempted to look at consumer country, producer country partnerships. We fail to look at producer country partnerships. We often fail to learn from the consumer country partnerships and the inroads they are making when we look at, for example, the minerals security partnerships, how they are pooling resources in order to support their supply chains. We fail to look at, US, Japan, US, America, EU, and its member states. We tend to focus more on global north, Global South partnerships. I wanted to frame that so once I'm answering, we shouldn't all lay lots of emphasis on only partnerships, Global South, Global North, because Africa has a role to play in ensuring that there are mutually beneficial partnerships that exist within the context where I come from. So the minister touched a lot already on what a mutually beneficial mineral partnership should be. It's one that shifts the focus from extractivism, the traditional replay of mines from pit to port, where value is added somewhere and all the jobs, the tech is developed somewhere else, and all Africa is left with its barrage of negative impacts, human rights and environmental impacts. Mutually beneficial partnerships, what we want is partnerships that do not transfer those externalities to the African countries. We see mutually beneficial partnerships as one that hinge around shared economic value. We've mentioned the fact that there is need for skills development, where it's not only supporting African countries to extract the minerals, but to actively engage in processing, refining, manufacturing, and that entails developing allied industries to support this refining and processing industries. We are also looking at partnerships that are fair enough where it enhances equal sharing of rewards. Here we are looking at benefit sharing and beneficiation. We see mutually beneficial mineral partnerships as partnerships where the revenues from minerals are shared equitably between the mineral-rich countries and the mineral-producing countries and consuming countries. We see partnerships that are hinged on non-negotiable terms, including the respect for free and proper informed consent of communities, transparent governance mechanisms that are quite accountable and open, where we can understand how local procurement and revenue sharing or benefit sharing exist, and of course, partnerships that strengthen Africa's agency when it comes to negotiating those kind of partnerships, because what we understand is Africa negotiators go around the table without a clear understanding of what they are going to negotiate. We see mutually beneficial mineral partnerships as ones that recognize Africa's agency by virtue of the fact that they have jurisdictional power over those resources and should have a strong say when it comes to negotiating how those resources are extracted and used. Thank you.
They're really great points, and I want to come back to that agency point you make, which I think is really key, because obviously no one's passive in these discussions, and no one should be passive. And Thomas, I'd like to come to you about this. NRGI works with governments to support decision making around governance of mineral resources. Based on your experience and some of the research that you do, what can resource-rich developing countries do to actually shape and have this agency and shape some of these partnerships? What leverage do they have? And we've seen a growing number of countries resorting to export restrictions to ensure the value addition is happening in countries and that some of the processing is happening in countries. And earlier, I'm not sure if you were in the room, but Sasha Raab of UNIDO mentioned that, it's fair game, basically. What do you make of that?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the discussion so far. Yeah, I've been here from the start, and it's been really great. Lots of in-depth, practical conversations. So yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that any low middle income country can do is make sure they've got a government-wide mineral-specific strategy. Many countries now have strategies to guide their approach to the sector, but actually fewer of them have strategies that are detailed enough to effectively guide negotiations, as Eric just mentioned. So to really sort of guide governments on what they want, what investors and partners need and want, and importantly for governments, what trade-offs they're willing to make. And the optimal approach will differ from mineral to mineral. I mean, because it's the World Cup, I think for once I'm allowed to indulge in a football analogy. But like a manager of a football team will sort of give a specific role to each player based on their strengths, their weaknesses, their opposition. And it's the same for minerals. And just to kind of highlight one example of one country that I think has done this well is Botswana, which is well known for successfully using their leverage with De Beers to pursue domestic cutting and polishing of diamonds. But actually why I think they're a model to kind of spotlight is because they've taken a much more cautious approach when it comes to copper smelting and refining, because they recognize that the economics and the benefits of smelting and refining copper for Botswana are very different to pursuing diamonds. And for Zambia, as the director said, a big copper country, the calculus is different again. So countries need to be sort of looking at each mineral, looking at what sort of development pathway makes sense for each of the different minerals. And then once they've figured that out, just looking to see what leverage they have. And one source of leverage is definitely export restrictions, as Sasha said. But they don't always work, and they're not the only way to sort of to have leverage. And another example I quite like, because again I don't think it kind of, there's more to it than meets the eye, is Indonesia. We know it for imposing an export ban on nickel, and that resulting in a successful push down the nickel value chain. What is often not discussed is an export ban was also placed on bauxite, and it resulted in a big crash in production, at least initially. And the fact that they didn't actually just use an export ban to move along the nickel value chain. They used a much wider package of policy support, including tax incentives, regulated energy prices, and that wider package provided them with greater leverage. But obviously that package comes with a cost in terms of actual financial resources, political capital, time, and therefore countries need to figure out, going back to the trade-offs point, okay, well, if we invest all this effort and cost into pursuing value addition in this one mineral, what does it mean for value addition, a value addition approach in other minerals or other ways to benefit? So yeah, mineral-specific strategies are absolutely key, I think.
Yeah, not every single country is going to be able to develop a whole supply chain or value chain for every single mineral that they have, right? And we'll definitely have shortly discuss cooperation, because I think that's a really important topic. But before we do that, Wenyu, I just wanted to come to you because circularity actually was given quite a lot of space in the G7 statement last week, and particularly there was a line that mentioned that the G7 recognizes circularity as an opportunity for emerging and developing economies to capture value from those minerals. And I'm, wondering, circularity is often treated as a bit of a nice-to-have add-on, right? It's kind of the last thing that we maybe think about. But actually, can you talk about the role that those principles of circularity can play to support producing resource-rich countries to capture that value?
So I agree with everything that's said so far. We got some great analysis about the opportunity even in a linear extractive economy. We also got a great football analogy as well out of that. I think the reason Ellen MacArthur Foundation looks at circular economy of critical minerals is we recognize there needs to be an additional narrative to the story. Of course, it is about geopolitics. Of course, it is about supply chain fragility. These things are real. But if you take a step back, and the way you started this conversation this afternoon, we look at all the critical minerals going into EV batteries, into stationary storage, into renewables, into the grid. compounded creates this exponential amount of critical minerals demand, and it continues to grow. And then on top of that, as you mentioned, we're layering on top of that other critical mineral demands going into, for example, data centers for AI-driven growth, going into things like, for example, defense, electronics. And so you have the situation where critical minerals is important, of course, for geopolitical reasons, but it's also presenting a real serious collective challenge. Because if we continue to exacerbate the linear extraction system, it can help us to some extent, but it is not going to solve the collective challenge that we have, which is meeting the volume and pace of critical minerals needed. And that's why if you look at some of the forecasts out there, they will say, depending on timeline, depending on critical minerals, but there will be instances where you will have a supply deficit. And so where do we end up there? If you don't look at circular economy, you go down a few different paths. First, you may say, let's collectivize and create alliances, and there's a bee flying around somewhere. And that makes a lot of sense. That's perfectly natural, right? So that's like the G7 coalition, for example, but it risks treating this conversation as a zero-sum conversation. Then you go down the other path of saying, hey, let's accelerate mining. Of course, you can do that to a certain extent, but one of the panels earlier already mentioned, if you push that too hard, you break the system, you break rules and regulations, and you break social license. And then lastly, you have this Hail Mary. Why don't we look at magic bullets like deep sea mining, right? And if you actually look at the brochures of companies promoting deep sea mining, they think they're doing it for the greater good. They will talk about how deep sea mining is necessary for the energy transition. And there's a very blatant opportunity in front of us, which is circular economy, all right? And that needs to be part of all these conversations of all the things that we have to our leverage. And for me, looking at circular economy challenges our conception of win-win partnerships. Because what you do is you say, compared to a linear system, a circular system is not where you just add the idea that developing countries can get a slither of this value in this part of the value chain, a slither of this value in this part of the value chain. You fundamentally redescribe the value pool. So you look at, for example, things that were previously waste, which are now high-value critical mineral waste in EV batteries. You look at things, for example, that were previously EV battery waste, and you say, we can now put this on the grid to fortify the grid that needs more renewable energy, right? And that can happen in developing countries as well. So if you reconceptualize the value chain that you see today from a linear system to a circular value chain, not just a linear value chain with a little bit of recycling tag on the end, you create new opportunities for developing countries to participate. I just want to end on one example. I grew up in Southeast Asia. When I was growing up in Southeast Asia, I, like all the young people, wanted to have a cool phone. I fixed my phone probably 5 times in Southeast Asia. I never got my phone fixed in UK in 15 years of living here. And that's because we underestimate economic opportunities that come from circular economy. For example, informal refurbishment, repair, economies that actually exist to a large extent, and it's very functional in many developing markets. But we don't capture that because that's informal and because it doesn't play as much into government's conception of what contributes to our GDP. So I think if you reconceptualize what circularity is, it's not just another tick box. It's not just us going, well, it's low carbon, it's sustainable, now it also has to be circular. We're not making things hard for people. It's an immense economic opportunity for all countries, producer and consumer countries. It changes the narrative of what the definition of these two things mean. It creates opportunities for you to create economic opportunities from resources that you otherwise would throw away, or products that you otherwise would throw away. New business models, there's so much opportunities here.
Such fascinating points. I'm so glad you can make these points as part of this conversation, because I think we just need to be able to have this joined up thinking. And as you say, it's not a sort of just the recycling at the end of the value chain. Tobias, I'd like to come back to you and pick up on something that Eric said that I thought was really interesting, that, you know, when we think of partnerships, it's often presented as a sort of global north to global south, or consumer country to producer country. But actually, regional cooperation, particularly in Africa, which is at home to so many of the minerals that we need for clean energy technologies, is vital in order to be able to add value and pool these resources, but also pool perhaps things like infrastructure and power, which you initially mentioned. Zambia is part of several initiatives, including the Lobito Corridor initiative, which is linking big railway that's linking Zambia DRC to port in Angola. But there's also been an agreement with the DRC to look at a special economic zone around battery precursors. So I'm just wondering if you can explain from where you sit in Zambia, like what does regional cooperation actually look like? Where do you see the opportunity? And perhaps if there's any recent developments of some of these initiatives I've just mentioned that you could let us in on, that'd be great to hear.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. I think Zambia and DRC have an MOU which is subsisting to put together economic zones, as it were, to manufacture EV battery precursors. From our side, as Zambia, we have so far done quite a lot in terms of picking up the site, that site which is just closer to the DRC on the Copper Belt. We've now gone into developing a strategy that will guide the development of the transboundary, so to speak, manufacturing of precursor batteries for EV. We've also undertaken quite extensive stakeholder mapping and engagement from our end. We've, under the ministry which is responsible for commerce, set up a working group which is multi-sectoral in nature, which has the industry players from the mining sector, the commerce players, the academia, and various business associations to marshal the needed resources to ensure that once the transboundary facility is undertaken, it's able to look at the issues of the resources. As you may be aware, that Zambia and DRC share quite substantial resources in terms of cobalt and copper, which is expected to go into the manufacturing of the EV precursor batteries. But we are also aware that our colleagues from the Congolese side have picked up the site. We've also put in place a battery council, which is chaired by, I think, a high-level government official. So we have, again, we're working with the development financial institution, Afrexim Bank, which is helping us in terms of looking at the resources that would be critical in terms of actualizing these facilities, as it were. But we're also taking advantage of the investment that is expected to pour into the Lobito corridor. As you may be aware, that there are two areas on the Zambian side, which is the Copper Belt and Northwestern Province, which are a gateway for this corridor. But what we see from this corridor is that it should be more of developmental and not a conduit to move mineral commodities into other jurisdictions, as it were. So in a nutshell, I think those are some of the key interventions that Zambia has undertaken from its end, but also the DRC, which I can't delve too much because I think they're also doing their part. But from our end, I think quite a lot has gone into the preparations, and we hope to see quite significant movements towards the actualization of the special multi-facility economic zone, but also working with the various partners. The EU are part of the team that is able to provide support towards the actualization of the Lobito corridor. So quite significant interventions that are going towards the corridor, but also towards the setting up of the multi-facility economic zone to leverage from the resources that the two countries, Congo and Zambia, has, as it were. So I think essentially that's what I can say for now.
And briefly, just following up on that, to what extent is this regional cooperation, do you think, allowing you to set better terms when you are negotiating mineral deals and partnerships, or when you're having these conversations with potential investors or potential partner companies or countries? Can you talk a little bit about the role that you see this cooperation playing as you are negotiating new deals that will shape Zambia's industrialization strategy and policy for probably years or decades to come?
Thank you very much. I think one of the benefits that we see and the opportunity that arises from the negotiations as we engage with the various partners is the fact that we are pulling resources together at a regional level. We're looking at mineral resources that DRC and Zambia has, which provides an opportunity for any investor to engage into the exploitation of green minerals, as it were, cobalt and copper. But we're also looking at leveraging from, using the regional cooperation frameworks to have a fiscal and regulatory framework that will speak to investment, so that the Congo and DRC and Zambia can harmonize their fiscal and regulatory environment to pull resources into that region. But we're also looking at taking advantage of resources such as the skills that we have between the two countries to ensure that we can leverage from, the two countries have quite a huge population in terms of young population, but also graduates that will be able to be utilized in terms of these special economic zones. So I think those facets, obviously, we have also the technology that we think we can put together as a country, but also it's good, it's an advantage to negotiate from that point as we engage with partners, because then you have two countries pulling resources together. So I think from that vantage point, we're able to leverage from the endowments that we have in terms of mineral resources, but also as a population that we have the two countries put together. But I think overall, we're also looking at the regional market. I think the SADC region, where Zambia and DRC belong, is a huge market for quite a number of products that will come from mineral beneficiation and value addition. So we think going forward, those aspects will be able to help the two countries to sell their special economic zones, but also leveraging from the development corridor that we are talking about, the Lobito corridor on the other side of the country, but also looking at the Tazara, where the Chinese government is trying to put investment so that we can leverage from not only the Lobito corridor, but also the Tazara corridor on the other side of the country.
Yes, the Tazara corridor is from another railway from Zambia to a port in Tanzania, going the other way, and Zambia sits in the heart really of all these infrastructure developments. But Eric, I'd like to bring it back to you. I mean, just to build on what Tobias has just said. I mean, you mentioned the need for these South-South partnerships. Can you outline a little bit more about what do you think that looks like, and what African leaders and governments can actually do to deepen and to make this type of cooperation a reality?
Thank you very much. I think Africa is so diverse, culture and also the mineral landscape. So that's an opportunity to celebrate where there is capacity, where there are competencies, where there is potential for diverse minerals. And of course, one country cannot develop a full battery chain. There's need for that collaboration, that cooperation amongst countries celebrating this diverse potential. And the example of the DRC and Zambia, it's one of those examples of a win-win, South-South, mutually beneficial mineral partnership. And we expect more of this to happen on the continent, because the fear is for what's existed is individual countries going to negotiate individual deals with different countries. But we see DRC Zambia as an example where there's a pooling of expertise, resources, knowledge to be able to negotiate deals that are beneficial to the country. And again, one of the important things around this kind of South-South win-win partnerships we want to see is avoiding the race or the risk of a race to the bottom, where we've got countries competing amongst themselves and, of course, lowering their standards, tax regimes in order to attract investments. But if we have countries coming together to be able to define clear terms of negotiations, then it better protects these countries against external or the impunity of corporate entities that come to negotiate deals with them. And of course, such coordination builds a stronger voice. We have examples of G7 and a couple of other partnerships I mentioned, US, Japan, and the others, and they build a strong voice, a strong negotiating front. We expect to see those kind of opportunities occurring in Africa, where there's a coordinated front, a coordinated voice that goes around the table to negotiate deals that are beneficial to the continent, and not going to negotiation tables on an isolated and dispersed rank. So that's what I see.
And do you think that cooperation is happening? I mean, there are, the DRC Zambia example is an early sign of that, but I mean, there still needs to be loads of investment, and we're kind of a long way away from this being implemented. So, do you see what gives you hope that this can actually happen on the continent?
Well, I think the example of Zambia, it's a good prototype, I would say, where the frameworks, the groundworks are being laid, and the two governments are working closely to ensure that this comes out successful and benefits the two countries. The minister raised the question of, well, we want to this Lobito corridor shouldn't be a pit to port development where it's simply facilitating minerals from a port and shipped away, but ensuring that there is some value addition happening on the continent. There is the economic zones that have been he mentions in both the two sites, which are under development, and they've set up specific institutions to ensure that this happens. Well, we might be tempted to look at the coordination only at the government level, but there's a lot happening within the civil society landscape to ensure that this works. We have the African Coalition on Green Minerals, which is a homegrown African coalition that seeks to push for this kind of representative voice, Africa's position when it comes to transition minerals, what Africa wants out of that. There is Resource Justice Network and the Just Energy Transition Networks. So at the governmental level, there are these movements to push for coordination. At the civil society level, there is this push for coordination as well. And the government and the civil society working together would be a positive step towards ensuring that this coordination happens. Thank you.
Super. Thomas, building just on that as well, from a government's perspective, what are the kinds of considerations that we need to see in contracts and in agreements, to make sure that some of these benefits actually trickle down, or not trickle down, actually are built in these partnerships to ensure that producing countries do reap the benefits and share the benefits from the mineral extraction and processing. Are there specific things that we should be looking at in the wording or of these contracts or agreements?
Yeah, good question. I think first, it's been great to hear throughout the day actually an emphasis on the fact that to get stable partnerships or stable contracts, you need those partnerships or contracts to benefit not only the investor or the country sort of seeking minerals from outside, but also the citizens, the communities, and the government from the countries that the minerals come. Without all of those parties being comfortable with the deal in the sort of long term, then that deal is inherently fragile. So yeah, as a first step, making sure that contracts do strike that balance between so again, the allocation of risks and benefits right, and in the way that Eric and the director have talked about in terms of meeting producer low middle income priorities and informed by the sort of that clear strategy that I was talking about earlier. But even a fair deal is inherently sort of fragile if it's not transparent and consultative. We see a lot of these partnerships, a lot of the MOUs, the roadmaps, and then of course a long history in the mining sector of contracts being negotiated behind closed doors and just among a small group of people. There has been a significant progress in terms of contract disclosure over the last sort of decade or so. But potentially with the speed at which a lot of these deals are being made, the complexity of a lot of these deals, how these state-state partnerships are then informing lots of different sort of state investor agreements, increasingly sort of linked to infrastructure. There's a risk actually that some of that progress is lost, and we go back to a world of opacity and a lack of consultation and due diligence.
So transparency and I guess some kind of joined up thinking with other consideration, like I mean the transport infrastructure, the power infrastructure, are also things that need to be thought through in these deals, right?
Yes, and enforceable obligations. So a lot of I think companies, investors, governments who are looking for minerals are getting very good at knowing what to say. I feel like the language when I go to the Africa Mining Indaba that I hear from the private sector is, or the difference in the language between different parties is reducing each year as everyone learns to kind of say the right thing. So we're seeing in a lot of these partnership documents sort of commitments to ensure job creation in partner countries to move along the value chain. But what we need to make sure is that the contracts, the enforceable contracts, do actually contain obligations, which means, clear milestones, reporting requirements, accountable institutions, and then consequences if those obligations aren't met. And just to point to an example of good practice, Singapore has this great system of performance-based incentives. And so they annually review whether a company is meeting its contractual obligations. If it doesn't, the government reduces the tax incentives that it can access on an annual basis. So just making sure that those obligations are enforceable and then there are consequences if they're not met is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it kind of links back to the Mentimeter and some of the regulation that we need to see from governments to make sure that these standards are actually applied. I'd like to come back to you, talk about circularity again. I think, can you explain exactly how producing countries might benefit if circularity principles are really applied seriously in large consuming economies like Europe, like the US, China? Surely that reduces then the demand for some minerals on which a lot of governments around the world are banking or are betting in order to be able to kickstart industrial policies. Sorry, we've got a really annoying fly on stage. To really sort of drive industrial policy and create jobs and boost revenues and all the stuff that we've been talking about. So how does that work? Where is the value that they can capture? What's in it for them, basically?
Yes, great question. And I guess the first thing to mention here is I wish it was true that Europe is implementing circular economy at large, because really, if you look at it, a lot of the conversation is about recycling. And recycling is super important, of course, right? But it is not everything. And I wish it was right that Europe is looking at things like design, because the reality is a lot of our products with critical minerals are designed for structural integrity rather than the ability to be refurbished or to be repaired or to be disassembled. And that creates a lot of lock-in for the materials. But we're not really talking about that. Just earlier this week, there is a Chinese battery manufacturer and a European utility who for the first time announced that they're going to work together on a battery swapping program, which It's not only good for consumers, it's good for electrification of transport, but it's also really good if done correctly for circular economy because of a much more efficient use and management of batteries. But we're also just starting to do that. So actually one of the problems isn't that we're going to recycle too much. It's actually we're not pulling all the levers we can yet. We're thinking about infrastructure, we're thinking about technology, but we're not doing enough in looking upstream at circular design. We're not doing enough of using the technology we already have, but reconceptualizing the way we make profit or work with each other through, for example, circular business models. So actually, I wish it was true we're doing more. But even if we're to do more, right? Let's say we have more recycling today, we have more bam, 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 everything today. The reality is, there isn't enough critical minerals in the world in stock for us to solve all our problems overnight. Mining is still going to continue in the near term because it's a necessity. So it's not really the case that you have this sort of immense time period of struggle here where like someone must win and someone must lose because primary extraction is going to continue for a period of time, the fly is back, and that's okay. The longer term opportunity, the bigger conversation of circular economy doesn't come from this conversation of, well, if you're more circular, does someone lose out? It's the fact that you grow the pie as a whole. Because while circular economy creates opportunities for consumer countries, the distinctions start to break down, by the way, it also creates opportunities for producer countries. My friend Kerr, sitting in the audience, just to embarrass her, is looking at examples of how you can, for example, in developing countries, use second life batteries or cascade use of batteries for things like promoting a better grid or more energy access or more affordable access. Those are things that can happen in developing countries today. The reality is also recycling is not going to be in this country versus this country. We tend to polarize our thinking. We think, well, we've got to have recycling everywhere or we can't rely on anyone. The reality is there's probably going to be regional hubs of recycling still in many of the developing markets and developing market regions. So there will be opportunity. And finally, they are already innovators, by the way, in emerging markets. For the last 12 months, we traveled to many different countries. We engaged with stakeholders, for example, in Vietnam, India, Thailand, other places in South and Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa as well. You'll be surprised at the ingenuity and the sort of underground, scrappy innovation that comes up that in some way constitutes circular economy and more productive reuse or recovery of critical minerals. There's a guy in India looking at how a specific component going into the battery makes it easier to recycle. He can capture value with that market. There's that person in Vietnam looking at how AI can help sort e-waste better. He can capture that market. There's the refurbished market sitting somewhere in a shopping mall in Bangkok that's much more efficient than anything we've seen in the UK. So the fact isn't just, is there a zero-sum game and are we going to stop producing stuff? Developing countries, producer countries, whatever you call them, have a lot to win from circular economy as well, right? And we should be focused on maximizing those innovations and maximizing those business models.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and thank you for bringing so many sort of concrete examples of discussion. I found it really, really interesting. Aware of time, and I'm probably the engineer of the room is starting to flag a little bit. But Tobias, I would like to just return to you to just talk a little bit more about governance, because Zambia last year co-sponsored a UN Environment Assembly resolution on creating. On coming up with a binding, perhaps, or it put on the table this idea of having a binding or non-binding instrument to make mineral supply chains more resilient, more sustainable, more transparent. This was like co-sponsored with Colombia, and there's been an election since in Colombia, and the government has gone rather the sort of completely the other way, and it's unclear where they'll stand on some of this. But I'm just wondering if you had any updates for us on those efforts and what might come next. I know that there's been some discussions on this, I think, due to happen this year. Is there anything that you can tell us about where those efforts are going and whether you still believe that some multilateral initiative is needed to close the governance gap?
Yes, indeed. I think we did sponsor that motion, but I think overall what government policy is in terms of multilateral governance institutions that anchor issues of critical minerals is very, very important. And from where we stand as a country, we still believe that partnerships that has to nurture critical minerals, as it were, either at continental level at global level are very critical because I think there are quite a number of issues that we need to deal with at regional, but also at the global perspective. I think there are quite a number of dynamics that the green transition and decarbonization agendas brought into fore. And we know as a country that there are quite a number of multilateral institutions, but also government-to-government institutions that are trying to court the relationship with various countries, including Zambia. But I think we are also mindful that we have structures at the AU, African Union, and we think that such structures should somehow be led by Africa so that we pull resources in one direction. But we are also saying that this can still cascade to global perspective. I'm aware that quite a number of countries that are trying to see how we can work with them, China, the US you mentioned, and quite a number of countries, including the UK. So as a country, we think that we are open for such partnerships as long as there's mutual benefit and a win-win situation for the country, for the region, and also for the continental and the global perspective. So we believe that multilateralism in terms of green energy transition is the way to go because I think all of us are in this perspective together. So we believe that we should be able to nurture quite a number of partnerships vis-a-vis in terms of how we leverage from the critical minerals and green transition agenda, as it were. Thank you.
Thank you for that update. Okay, I think we'll open it up to questions if that's okay. Hopefully hear a bit from you because it's been a long discussion session. I would love to have your input if you're still with us. So are there any questions to the panel, to any of our panelists? Gabriela's got a mic. Any questions?
Sorry. Yeah. I've walked away too far, sorry. My name is Andy Whitmore with the Deep Sea Mining Campaign, but probably more relevant here is I've just written a report for the UK Trade Justice Movement on how the UK government can make fairer agreements when it's trade agreements around critical minerals. And I guess with that in mind, it's interesting going back to the first session, and we talked about the G7 Evian Declaration, and it's fascinating to me that that doesn't mention human rights, it doesn't mention social issues, it mentions environment once, but only to do with circularity. So it seems to me that as we're moving more and more into this focus on securitization of minerals, we seem to be moving further and further away from some of the aspects that make mineral partnerships equitable, which have been mentioned here, free, prior, informed consent, and mentions of human rights, how we can make those critical minerals agreements just. So I guess my question, which I'm afraid is a horrible one, is like, what can we do now to try and put some of those key elements sort of back into those agreements and back into those key partnerships, particularly the sort of plethora of MOUs and all the different agreements that are coming up now between particularly producer-consumer countries? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. Is there any other question now? We could maybe take a couple at a time. Oh, yes, Phil, go for it. Yeah.
Sorry. Just one question from me, really building a bit on what Andy was saying, but just, in the agreements that are going to be so important, there's a danger, of course, that we're making sure that there's a transfer of wealth from northern elites to southern elites, and that we have a means by which global elites basically redistribute some of the wealth between themselves, rather than trying to make sure that there is genuine elements of co-ownership down in, so that the benefits are distributed much more evenly across societies, both in the north and in the south. And I just wondered whether you can see, particularly perhaps Tobias, but also other people on the panel, ways in which the multilateral agreements, the regional agreements, and the national processes can be developed in such a way as that those kind of redistribution of wealth and power can be better served.
Okay, great question. maybe we'll start with those two. Thomas, maybe do you want to address that first point from Andy about how do we bring back the environmental and social safeguards and human rights language into these agreements which seem to have vanished, or maybe were never there in the first place, perhaps as well?
Yeah, and I guess particularly from thinking about the UK and back to the first session, and I think Patrick made the point that actually probably a starting point for the UK G20 presidency when it's thinking about critical minerals should be the critical minerals framework that was agreed under the South African G20 presidency that had a much more positive vision of what minerals can do for countries with those resources, but also recognize the serious harms that they could do. And I think that would be a really important starting point. And to make sure that that then is sort of built on further, I think making sure that there is the G20 process is sort of fully participatory, that there's a formal dialogue platform maybe sort of established between the G20 and a wider group of low and middle income mineral rich countries would be really valuable.
Eric, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just to add, I mean, I did mention from the African perspective where there's need for some coordinated voice, because those who bear the brunt of environmental and human rights abuses are communities where minerals are extracted. And it's incumbent on our governments to play a more frontline role in terms of pushing in the international forums, G20, COPs, trade negotiations, to ensure that they are vocal around the inclusion and respect of human and environmental requirements when it comes to negotiation of trade deals or the development of policies that bear on the production and use of minerals. That's a quick addition I could add, yeah.
Would you like to add anything to that as well?
Yeah, just briefly. So I don't actually work in policy and governance. This is probably a bad time to out myself. I rely a lot on my very intelligent policy colleagues to explain to me. And one thing I've noticed is I'm always the one coming to them and saying, for example, with the G7 statement, this is brilliant, but why didn't they say this? Why didn't they say that? And to explain to a simple-minded person like me, they basically said, look, these processes about, first and foremost, getting your foot in the door with the issues that you care about, getting those wins, but then keep harping on about those wins. Because when I look at some of these statements, for example, if you look at circularity, is circularity defined a very narrow way? It is still a win, but you have to, you have to continue to harp on the issue of circularity in the statement. If you look at the issue of resilience, it's defined in a very particular way. It's resilience to those countries. It's not about system resilience of delivering the energy transition, for example. So if you look at the term, there are good wins, but it does require, my understanding is, for us to continue to push on those issues, but looking beyond the language to defining it in a way that actually benefits the system, right? Because if we just say circularity is recycling, then we're missing out a big picture. If we say resilience is just resilience for these people rather than system resilience, we're also missing out a big picture.
Great. Tobias, hopefully you heard that question, but there was a question about, wealth and power redistribution in these mineral agreements and trade deals. Do you see ways in which we can achieve that? Some form of power and wealth. I think Phil meant monetary wealth rather than resource wealth, but monetary wealth, to some of these producing countries, like for example to Zambia. What would be a way to achieve that?
Yeah, indeed. I think just to stress that mining thrives on three limbs. One is that it should be able to deliver economic benefits to the country, but also you look at the environment. Sustainable, and lastly you look at the social aspect. So whatever agreement the country or a regional cohort enters into, I think it should be hover around these three areas, because agreements should be able to, mining agreements for that matter, should be able to deliver economic benefits, social effect, but also the environment. So essentially, as you develop these agreements, you should be able to embed these three aspects. But suffice to mention that from our side as a country, I think the policy and legal framework, again, highlights the importance of this in the mining sector, even as we venture into agreements with the private sector, various government jurisdictions. We look around these three areas, and therefore it is important to see how these, from the word go, are embedded into the agreements, but also to ensure that we tick the boxes as we implement the agreements, as it were. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other final questions? Yeah, Megan, and there's a question at the back as well. Let's take 2 questions.
Hi, Megan Rowling. I'm the editor of Climate Home News. Chloe is our absolute expert on this topic, and she knows a lot more than me. Yeah, I wanted to just maybe highlight the elephant in the room, which is that businesses have not been here discussing with you some of these topics, and I don't think that was for want of trying, right? And you know, it seems a shame that they are not here to engage in this conversation. But because they're not, yeah, I just wanted to ask, what would your ask to them be in terms of like making mineral partnerships more equitable? What do the companies themselves need to do in order to deliver those equitable partnerships? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And at the back, I think.
Yeah, thank you. My name's Neil Walker, and it's been a really lovely conversation all afternoon, so thanks so much to all the panelists. I guess, I don't know if I've missed this, I've had to go in and out a little bit, but the European Union is looking to expand its own mineral extraction and processing. So is the UK. You've got the Critical Minerals Challenge Centre there. Then you've got Brazil, which is looking to expand its recycling facilities, but also its extraction. This feels to me like coming into sharp contrast with certain things like land use, agricultural goals, obviously biodiversity restoration, deforestation, et cetera, in the context of partnerships and in policy. How do we balance these things together? What does the EU's desire to do this? And I think there was a point earlier about the distinction between kind of producing companies and consuming countries. That seems probably like it's, you know, maybe a bit mixed. So just something about that and how we balance these things together, because there's some of these things seem in contradiction to each other. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's loads of experts probably in the room, but I've heard this before, that we shouldn't really be saying consuming countries and producing countries. It's a shortcut because I think people vaguely know what we mean, but it's totally true that a lot of consuming countries are big producing countries. I mean, you know, China's a big mineral producer. Canada's a huge mineral producer. I mean, the US, as you say, Europe, and vice versa. You know, I mean, some of the big producing countries, I mean, you mentioned Brazil, that's a massive market as well. So let's say that, but you're right to point that out. But I wondering if anybody wants to respond either on the role of companies and businesses, what they can do, or what they should be doing to ensure that these partnerships are actually equitable, and maybe something on this point about how do we balance consuming and producing? Is that kind of right? And policy around it? Or did I misunderstand?
I think it was more in the context of expanding, say, mining within areas within the European Union, for example, which have also got goals for food self-sufficiency.
Oh, yeah. So I'm not sure anybody can speak specifically about the EU on this panel, but I guess maybe Thomas, do you want to say something, or when you about trade-offs? I guess this is kind of what the question is about.
I was gonna touch on the company's point, but
okay.
Yeah, I was also gonna.
Okay. I think no one wants to talk about trade-offs.
I guess I can, insofar as, yeah, I mean, these trade-offs are real, right? Yeah, it therefore requires, going back to, I guess, my first point around sort of doing before entering any sort of negotiation, is doing the kind of the homework of figuring out, for a country at least, looking to use its land and resources in the optimal way, is sort of figuring out, okay, well, where is it worth extracting minerals from and accepting those environmental and social harms, and where is it not? And definitely countries should be looking at establishing no-go zones for areas of particular environmental and social sensitivity. This fly seems to be attracted by like talking. Like it seems to always attack the one who's got the mic. And a lot of countries actually have that provision in their laws. So I think actually a lot of thinking needs to be done about how to kind of change the incentives to make those no-go zones more likely to be implemented by countries. And there's maybe some interesting lessons from say like the Central African Forest Initiative and sort of payments for maintaining forests. So I don't have like in terms of sort of the global picture, that's obviously a lot more complicated, but in terms of how a country, I guess, should be thinking about it, I think that's one place to start.
Do you want to say something about companies while you're got them?
I was just going to say, I guess it goes, one, despite my kind of slightly blithe remark about like companies knowing, getting better at knowing what to say, I think for the serious companies, and as this sort of discussion I think has highlighted, there is increased awareness of the fact that an equitable deal is a stable deal that is also in the long-term interest of the company. I think one way that companies can really ensure equitable deals is, well, and there's a specific example in Guinea with the Simandou project, was that the government got the company to actually pay for advisory support to the government through this very complex project negotiation and development process involving, like, obviously a huge railway as well as a huge iron ore project, and ensuring that support is independent and objective, and that has therefore resulted in the government feeling more able to strike a deal, actually getting that deal finally over the line, which has taken years to happen, and hopefully a deal that is going to be durable as a result. So that's just one actually quite small thing that companies could do.
Yeah, that's interesting. Wenyu, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, quickly. So at Ellen MacArthur Foundation, we have over 100 companies in our network. And I think that question was amazing because it is simultaneously super valid, but also it shows there's some kind of dissonance. Because when we work with companies on circular minerals, because that's my angle, we're working with miners, refiners, manufacturers of electronics, batteries, car makers, users, fleet users, recyclers, investors. And they are excited to be working together, to be collaborating. And they understand that there's a requirement for a platform for companies to come together, because you can't just address the problem at just the manufacturing level. You have to look across the value chain for collaboration. What you do upstream affects what happens downstream and vice versa. But there's also a real sense that beyond some kind of broad brush policy instruments, for example, let's look at recycling, let's look at restructuring, a lot of their work in circular minerals don't go recognized or aren't being incentivized. So I do think there's like a real meeting in the middle here, that of course a lot of companies out there need to be doing a lot more, but the ones doing a lot more aren't really being supported as well. That's my opinion.
Tobias, do you want to add anything, final word to you on this? Is there anything that you think companies should be doing to ensure equitable partnerships?
Yeah, so one of the key things we believe in, even from our side as Zambia, is that there's need for the mining companies to integrate their operations into the domestic economy. And it therefore follows that the issue of local content development for the areas where they operate for the community and for the citizenry remains very critical. And from our end, we promulgated local content regulations last year, and we think that will more or less bring the mining companies to operate within, integrate with the local economy, create jobs for the local people, but also ensure that there's a fair return on their investment without necessarily, making them panicky, as it were. But I think it's key that the mining companies really integrate with the local community so that the benefits accrue to both parties, return on investment, but also the local people, as it were. Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess local content requirements and regulations is one example of a way that that could be achieved, I suspect. Okay, we're going to leave it there. I'm sure there's loads more to say, but thank you so much for sticking with us on this hot day, and I'm sure you've had a long day already in London for London Climate Action Week, so thank you so much. Thank you so much for our wonderful panelists. I think we've had a real range of views, and thank you for coming and making these contributions.
You can stay there. A massive, massive thank you to Chloe, Thomas, Wenyu, and to Tobias for joining us from Lusaka, and of course to Eric. Thank you so much to all of you for being such a great and engaged audience, the level of interest and just the energy that you're displaying, being here with us since 2 p.m. I suspect that the AC may have something to do with it. For those of you who are here in London, we are going to be going for some informal drinks at the Old King's Head around the corner. Unfortunately, we can't take those of you joining us via the live stream, but we hope that you've had a wonderful afternoon joining us from wherever you are. So before we set off back into the heat wave, I wanted to leave you with Amir Shafai, who is Director of Legal and Economic Programs at NRGI, just to close our event. Amir.
Very much, Gabriela. Don't worry, I'm not trying to summarize around 4 hours of amazing insights in a couple of minutes. Mainly also because there's so much expertise in the room, and I think you guys want to speak to each other, and I want to speak to many of you, actually, as a part of the next steps. But I did want to have 2 thank yous and a request or a challenge. Thank you, obviously, on behalf of the co-hosts of this event, the Natural Resource Governance Institute, Climate Home News, Business and Human Rights Center. The extra R has disappeared and is tripping me up now. And obviously Chatham House. On behalf of us, all the organizers, to all the speakers, panelists, moderators, and the team at High House for hosting us so well with excellent air conditioning to boot. A big thank you to all of you. I think it's really amazing that we've had so many of our speakers and so many of the attendees stay for such a long period. We know it's a nice facility. We also know there's a lot more conversation happening around critical minerals at London Climate Action Week. It seems to be an evolution. So you have choices, and clearly you've chosen to be here. We appreciate that. And I think that's because actually we're building a community of practice around these issues. Increasingly, these issues around all of the things that we spoke about, community impacts, human rights, investor perspectives, governance issues, equitable partnerships are getting on the agenda a lot more than they were before. I think the challenge actually for us is as we look forward to next year or other aspects of this community of practice, both here and obviously in all the other places we are, what are we missing? What do we want to add? What is it that the next year's event should include? Is it about the G7 to G20 and the UK leadership? Is it about the absence of business here? Is it about multilateral development banks and their perspective as lenders into this space? Help us as a community of practice define what those priorities should be in the coming years, again, in this space and beyond. And thanks again to everyone for being here. I look forward to speaking with you soon, and thanks to all those who are online with us so long. Thanks.